The sound of tearing fabric echoed through the fort like a gunshot. Eliza Hart stood frozen as her carefully sewn dress, months of secret work, every stitch a prayer for acceptance, hung in shreds from Caroline Thornton's perfectly manicured hands. The commander's daughter smiled, cold as January wind. "Did you really think," Caroline whispered loud enough for the gathering crowd, "that putting a pig in silk would make it anything but a pig?" Laughter erupted. Eliza's vision blurred. But in the shadows beyond the torchlight, a mountain man with scars on his hands and kindness in his eyes had heard enough. Before you discover what happens next, please follow this story to the end, hit that like button, and comment your city below so I can see how far Eliza's journey travels across the world. The spring of 1873 came late to Red Hollow, Wyoming territory, dragging winter's bones behind it like a reluctant guest. Snow still clung to the northern slopes of the Beartooth Range, but down in the settlement, mud season had arrived with its usual enthusiasm, turning the main thoroughfare into a boot-sucking mess that separated the practical folks from the vain ones real quick. Eliza Hart belonged to the practical category, though not entirely by choice. She stood at the window of her small room above the general store, watching the settlement prepare for the spring dance with the kind of careful attention a person develops when they've spent most of their life on the outside looking in. Lanterns were being strung between the buildings. Fresh pine boughs decorated the entrance to the community hall. Even the horses seemed to sense something festive in the air, their breath pluming white in the cool evening. Eliza's reflection stared back at her from the wavy glass. A round face with honest brown eyes, dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, a body that had never matched the delicate ideal the Frontier magazines promised would make a woman worthy of love. At 23, she'd heard every variation of the same message. Too big, too plain, too much. Her fingers traced the edge of the dress laid across her narrow bed. 3 months of work. 3 months of saving every spare penny from her job, keeping books for the store. 3 months of sewing by candlelight after everyone else had gone to sleep, her fingers cramping around the needle, her eyes burning with fatigue and something that felt dangerously close to hope. The fabric was simple, a deep green cotton that reminded her of the pine forest surrounding the settlement, but she'd made it fit, made it beautiful. Tiny flowers embroidered along the neckline and cuffs, each one a small rebellion against the voice in her head that said she didn't deserve beauty. "You're really going?" Sarah, her roommate, and the store owner's daughter appeared in the doorway with her own dress already on, a confection of pink ruffles that made her look like a birthday cake. "Eliza, I don't mean to be cruel, but you know how Caroline and her friends are." "After last time I stayed home," Eliza interrupted quietly. "I've stayed home for 5 years, Sarah. I'm tired of staying home." Last time had been the harvest dance. Eliza had made it as far as the door before Caroline Thornton and her circle of Fort daughters had blocked her path, commenting loud enough for everyone to hear about how they'd need to reinforce the floorboards if certain people planned to dance. Eliza had turned around and walked back to her room, the laughter following her through the dark. That night, she'd promised herself she'd never try again. But promises made in humiliation had a way of weakening when spring came, when the world turned green and alive, when even the hardest soil pushed up flowers. "At least let me help with your hair," Sarah said, her voice gentler now. Despite everything, Sarah had a good heart. She just lacked the spine to use it when it mattered most. Eliza nodded, grateful for the small kindness. An hour later, she descended the stairs with her heart hammering against her ribs. The dress fit perfectly. She'd made sure of that, and Sarah had worked a small miracle with her hair, weaving it into a crown braid that made Eliza feel almost elegant, almost worthy. The walk to the community hall took 10 minutes, but it felt like 10 years. The building glowed with lamplight, music already spilling from the open doors, fiddle, guitar, and the stomp of boots on wooden floors. Through the windows, Eliza could see the dancing had already begun, couples whirling past in a blur of color and motion. Her stomach twisted into knots. She could still turn back. No one had seen her yet. She could walk back to her room, take off the dress, fold it carefully away, and tomorrow everything would be the same as it always was. Safe, small, invisible. Her hand touched the embroidery at her cuff, 3 months of hope stitched into fabric. Eliza took a breath and walked toward the door. She made it 3 steps inside before Caroline saw her. The music didn't stop. That would have required the musicians to care. But the conversations around the punch table went quiet in that particular way that meant people were watching without wanting to be seen watching. Caroline Thornton stood near the refreshments in a dress that probably cost more than Eliza earned in 6 months. Her blonde hair perfect, her smile sharp as a skinning knife. "Well, well," Caroline said, loud enough to carry. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence." Her companions, Millicent Foster and Jane Waverly, both daughters of Ford officers, turned as one, their expressions ranging from amused to predatory. Eliza's instinct was to back toward the door, but her feet kept moving forward. Some stubborn part of her refused to run. Not yet, not without trying. "Good evening, Caroline," Eliza said quietly, proud that her voice didn't shake. "That's quite a dress," Caroline continued, circling like a cat who'd found something interesting to torment. "Did you make it yourself? How industrious of you." "Thank you," Eliza said, knowing the compliment was anything but, choosing to treat it as one anyway. It was a strategy she'd learned young, refused to acknowledge the cruelty, and sometimes it lost its power. Not tonight, though. "I suppose when you can't buy anything pretty, you have to make do with whatever scraps you can find," Millicent added, her voice syrupy sweet. "Though I'm not sure that particular shade of green is doing you any favors. It makes you look rather like a pine tree," Jane finished, and all three dissolved into laughter that sounded like breaking glass. Heat crawled up Eliza's neck. Around them, conversations had resumed, but she could feel the sideways glances, the carefully turned backs that meant people were listening while pretending not to. No one was going to defend her. No one ever did. "Excuse me," Eliza murmured, trying to step around Caroline toward the punch bowl. Maybe if she just ignored them, they'd get bored. Maybe... Caroline's hand shot out and grabbed the fabric at Eliza's shoulder. "Wait," Caroline said, her eyes glittering with something that made Eliza's blood run cold. "Is this stitching coming loose? Oh dear, we can't have you falling apart in the middle of the dance floor." She pulled, gently at first, then harder. The sound of tearing fabric echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Eliza watched in frozen horror as Caroline yanked the shoulder seam completely apart. The carefully sewn stitches popping one by one, the embroidered flowers she'd spent hours perfecting destroyed in seconds. Millicent grabbed the other shoulder, laughing, and pulled in the opposite direction. The dress split down the back with a sound like a scream. "Stop," Eliza whispered, but her voice came out too small, too broken. "Oh no," Jane said with mock concern, reaching for the hem. "The whole thing is just falling apart. What shoddy workmanship." They pulled and tore with the efficiency of people who'd been raised to destroy things for sport, their laughter high and bright and terrible. Eliza stood paralyzed, her mind unable to process what was happening fast enough to make her body move. Around them, the dance continued, the music played, people turned away. In 30 seconds, 3 months of work became rags hanging from Eliza's shoulders. Caroline stepped back, examining her handiwork with satisfaction. "There. Much better. Now you look exactly like what you are." Eliza's vision blurred. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The walls of the hall seemed to press in from all sides, the lamplight too bright, the music too loud. Every face turned toward her, or deliberately turned away equally unbearable. She ran. The night air hit her face like a slap, cold and clean and merciless. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to be away, anywhere away, somewhere she could disappear and never be seen again. Her feet carried her past the last buildings of the settlement, past the corrals where horses stirred restlessly in the dark, past the neat boundaries of civilization into the wild spaces beyond. The torn dress tangled around her legs. She ripped it the rest of the way off without thinking, standing in the darkness, in nothing but her chemise and petticoat, the green fabric crumpled in her hands like a murdered thing. Eliza collapsed against a pine tree, sliding down until she sat in the needles and old snow, and finally let herself break. The sobs came from somewhere deep, somewhere she usually kept locked tight. They tore out of her chest like something with claws, taking pieces of her composure with them. She'd been so stupid, so pathetically, desperately stupid to think things could be different, to think she could walk into that hall and be treated like a person instead of a punchline. She pressed the ruined dress against her face and cried until her throat was raw. That looked like it hurt. Eliza's head snapped up. A man stood about 10 feet away, half in shadow, watching her with the kind of stillness that suggested he'd been there for a while. He was tall. Most men were to her, with shoulders that spoke of hard work and a face that would never be called handsome, but had a certain weathered integrity. Dark hair, longer than was fashionable, brushed the collar of a buckskin coat. His hands hung loose at his sides, no threat in his posture, but no uncertainty either. Eliza recognized him, though they'd never spoken. Silas Boone, the mountain man who came into town 4, maybe 5 times a year for supplies, did his business without talking to anyone, and disappeared back into the high country. People said he'd lost his family somehow, though the stories varied depending on who was telling them. People said a lot of things about Silas Boone, most of them probably nonsense. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said when she didn't respond. His voice was rough from disuse, but not unkind. "I was heading back to my camp when I heard—" He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Eliza's humiliation was written all over her face, clutched in her hands, hanging in rags from her shoulders. "Please go away," she whispered. "I could do that," Silas agreed. He didn't move. "But I don't think I will." "Why?" The word came out broken, angry. "You want a closer look at the joke? You want to tell me how I should have known better, how I should have stayed where I belonged?" "No, ma'am." He took a careful step closer, the way a person might approach a wounded animal. "I want to fix it." Eliza laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "You can't fix this. It's destroyed." "The dress is destroyed," Silas corrected. "That's different." "I don't—" Eliza started, but he held up a hand. "Give me 1 hour," he said. "1 hour, and I'll bring you something those vultures could never tear apart, no matter how hard they try." "Why would you do that?" Eliza stared at him, trying to find the angle, the hidden cruelty. Nobody helped her without wanting something. That was just how the world worked. Silas crouched down so they were at eye level. In the moonlight, she could see his face more clearly, scarred along the jaw, lines around the eyes, but steady. So steady it made something in her chest ache. "Because 5 years ago, I came into town after a bad winter," he said quietly. "Lost 3 traps, nearly froze to death, barely had enough fur to trade for a sack of flour. Your boss wouldn't extend credit. Said I was a bad risk. I was about to head back into the mountains with nothing when you came downstairs with a package. Said I'd overpaid last time, and this was the difference. There was enough dried meat, coffee, and flour in that package to get me through to spring." Eliza blinked. She barely remembered that. It had been such a small thing. "I didn't overpay," Silas continued. "We both knew it. You lied on the books for a stranger because you saw someone who needed help and you helped him. Nobody else in this settlement would have done that. Nobody else saw me as anything but a problem to be avoided." He stood, brushing pine needles from his knees. "So you give me 1 hour, Miss Hart. 1 hour to show you what people see when they bother to look past their own meanness. And then you decide, come back to that dance and show those folks what dignity looks like, or go home and let them think they won." Before Eliza could answer, he was gone, moving through the trees with the silent confidence of someone who belonged to the wilderness more than he'd ever belonged to civilization. She sat in the darkness, clutching her ruined dress, his words echoing in her head. 1 hour. It was the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard. What could he possibly do in 1 hour? Even if he could find fabric, which he couldn't, not at night, not in Red Hollow, even if he could sew, which she doubted, there wasn't enough time to create anything that wouldn't look exactly like what it was, a desperate, pathetic attempt to salvage a disaster. And yet something in his voice had sounded absolutely certain. Eliza pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaky, her chemise damp from snow and tears. She wrapped her arms around herself against the cold and waited. Because sometimes hope was less a choice than a stubborn reflex, and because she had nowhere else to go. The settlement behind her glowed with lamplight and music. The mountains ahead stood dark and watchful. And somewhere between civilization and wilderness, Silas Boone was doing something impossible. Eliza closed her eyes and counted her heartbeats, each one a second ticking away from the hour he'd promised. Somewhere around 300 she heard it, the rapid sound of hoofbeats approaching from the east, from the high country beyond the settlement. The rider pushed hard, the horse's breathing labored. Silas appeared through the trees, not on his usual mule but on a rangy dun gelding built for speed and rough country. He swung down before the horse had fully stopped and pulled something from his saddlebag. Even in the darkness, Eliza could see it was beautiful, pale leather, soft as water, with a subtle grain that caught the moonlight. Deerskin, Silas said, slightly breathless. White deer, actually. Rare as hen's teeth in these parts. I've been saving this hide for 3 years, waiting for the right use for it. You can't, Eliza started, but he was already moving, heading back toward town with purpose in every stride. Come on, he called over his shoulder. We're burning moonlight. Eliza followed, too stunned to argue, clutching the remains of her green dress like a shield. Silas led her not toward the community hall, but to a small cabin on the eastern edge of the settlement, one of the older structures built back when Red Hollow was more hope than reality. He knocked 3 times, a rhythmic pattern that sounded like code. The door opened to reveal a woman Eliza had seen around town but never spoken to. Mira Redbird, a Dakota woman who lived alone and did leather work that people whispered about in tones that mixed admiration with unease. Her work was too good, too beautiful, too different from the standard frontier fare. That made folks uncomfortable. Mira's dark eyes moved from Silas to Eliza to the hide in his hands. 1 hour, Silas said. Not a question, a statement of faith. Mira's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. You're asking for a miracle. I'm asking for your skill, Silas corrected. Miracle's just what people call skill they don't understand. Mira stepped aside, gesturing them in. The cabin's interior was small but meticulously organized, every surface covered with examples of her craft, bags with beadwork that seemed to glow in the lamplight, jackets with fringe that moved like water, moccasins decorated with patterns that told stories Eliza couldn't read but felt in her bones. Sit, Mira instructed Eliza, pointing to a stool. Turn around. Stand up. Lift your arms. Eliza obeyed, feeling like a dressmaker's dummy as Mira circled her with measuring eyes, occasionally making small sounds in her throat that could have meant anything. Silas stood near the door, the deerskin hide draped over his arm, watching with an intensity that should have made Eliza uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. Why are you doing this? Eliza asked him again, needing to understand. Because you deserve better than what they gave you, Silas said simply. And because I'm tired of watching good people get ground down by small ones. Mira made another sound, this one clearly amused. Philosophical tonight, are we? Just honest, Silas replied. Honest would be admitting you've been watching this girl for 2 years and haven't had the courage to speak to her, Mira said, spreading the deerskin across her work table and pulling out tools Eliza couldn't name. The tips of Silas's ears went red. That's not... I wasn't... Oh, you were, Mira interrupted, her hands already moving with swift confidence, marking the hide with a piece of charcoal. Every time you come to town, you find some excuse to walk past the general store, usually 3 or 4 times. Don't think I haven't noticed. Eliza's heart did something complicated in her chest. She turned to look at Silas, who was suddenly very interested in studying the ceiling beams. Is that true? She asked softly. Silas met her eyes, and in them she saw something that looked like the truth stripped bare. Yeah, he admitted. That's true. You're the only person in this whole settlement who ever looked at me like I was human instead of a curiosity. I guess I wanted to, I don't know, be near that, even if I didn't know how to say so. The admission hung in the air between them, honest and awkward, and somehow perfect. Well, Eliza said, her voice unsteady, that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. Then people have been failing you for a very long time, Mira observed, her knife moving through the deerskin with sure, swift cuts. Now, both of you be quiet and let me work. You want a miracle, you don't get to watch it happen. For the next 45 minutes, Mira's hands moved like they were conducting a symphony. She cut and shaped, stitched and adjusted, her needle flashing in the lamplight, her thread, something that looked like sinew, pulling the pieces together with a strength that belonged more to survival than decoration. Silas paced near the window, checking the position of the moon like a man measuring his remaining time. Eliza sat frozen on her stool, afraid to hope, afraid to breathe, afraid that any movement might shatter whatever magic was happening at that work table. Mira, Silas said when the moon had climbed another hand's width. I know what we need, Mira interrupted without looking up. Trust me, mountain man, I've been beating impossible deadlines since before you were born. 5 minutes later, she held up the dress. It wasn't anything like what Eliza had made. It wasn't anything like what Caroline wore or what the fashion plates promised would make a woman worthy. It was something entirely new, a dress that looked like it had grown from the frontier itself, pale deerskin decorated with subtle beadwork and patterns that echoed the mountains and forests, fringe that would move when she walked, sleeves that would allow freedom of movement, a neckline that was neither modest nor immodest, but simply right. It was a dress made for a woman who belonged to herself. "Put it on," Mira instructed. Eliza stood on shaking legs and let Mira help her into it. The leather was soft as a whisper, warm as summer, and fit like it had been made for her body specifically, not despite her size, but in celebration of it. The dress followed her curves without clinging, moved with her without restricting, made her look not smaller or more delicate, but more real, more present, more undeniably herself. She turned to the small mirror on Mira's wall and stopped breathing. The woman looking back at her was a stranger. Or maybe she'd always been there, just waiting for someone to see her clearly enough to prove she existed. "Well?" Silas asked, his voice rough. Eliza couldn't find words. She turned to face him instead and watched his expression shift from hope to something that looked like awe. "I'll be damned," he whispered. "Mira, you're a miracle worker." "I'm a craftsman," Mira corrected, but she looked pleased. The miracle was already there. I just made something worthy of it. The sound of music drifted through the window. They were still dancing at the community hall, still laughing, still celebrating like nothing had happened, like they hadn't just torn a woman apart for sport. Eliza's hands clenched into fists. "I can't go back there," she said. "I can't face them again." "Yes, you can," Silas said with absolute certainty. "But you don't have to. That's the difference. Before you went in hoping they'd accept you. Now, if you walk back in there, it's to show them you don't need their acceptance. You never did." He offered his arm like a gentleman, though everything about him screamed wilderness. "May I escort you to the dance, Miss Hart?" Eliza looked at his scarred hand, at Mira's fierce smile, at her own reflection in the mirror. She thought about this girl who'd spent 3 months sewing hope into green fabric, who'd believed that if she just tried hard enough, made herself small enough, perfect enough, she might earn a place at the table. That girl was gone now, torn apart as surely as the dress. The woman wearing deerskin and dignity was something new entirely. "Yes," Eliza said, taking his arm. "Yes, you may." They walked back through the settlement together, Mira following a few steps behind like a guard or a witness or both. The music grew louder as they approached. Through the windows, Eliza could see the dancing had reached its peak. Couples whirling, skirts spinning, the whole community hall alive with movement and light. At the door, Silas paused. "Last chance to change your mind," he said quietly. Eliza thought about all the times she'd made herself small, all the years she'd apologized for taking up space, all the moments she'd swallowed cruelty with a smile and pretended it didn't leave marks. "I'm done changing myself for other people," she said. She pushed open the door and walked in. The fiddle hit a high note just as Eliza stepped through the doorway, and for a heartbeat the music seemed to falter, as though the musician had caught sight of something that made his bow stutter across the strings. The dancers didn't stop, not immediately, but conversations died mid-sentence, laughter cut off like someone had slammed a door, and heads turned with the synchronized precision of a flock of startled birds. Eliza felt every eye in the room lock onto her. The deerskin dress caught the lamplight and seemed to glow from within, pale as moonlight on snow, the beadwork throwing back sparks of color that danced across the walls. The fringe swayed with each step she took, whispering against her legs, and somehow that small sound carried through the sudden silence like a promise or a threat. Silas's hand was steady under hers, his presence beside her solid as bedrock. Behind them, Mira moved through the door with the quiet confidence of someone who'd walked through hostile rooms before and lived to tell about it. Caroline Thornton stood frozen near the punch bowl, her perfect face cycling through expressions too fast to name: shock, disbelief, something that might have been fear before it hardened into fury. The torn green dress still lay in a crumpled heap near her feet, forgotten evidence of her cruelty. "That's impossible," Caroline said, her voice too loud in the quiet. "You couldn't have. There's no way." "And yet," Mira said pleasantly, her dark eyes glittering with something dangerous, "here she stands." Millicent Foster's mouth hung open in a way that would have gotten her scolded for being unladylike if anyone had been paying attention to her. Jane Waverly had gone pale, her gaze darting between Eliza and the ruined dress like she was trying to solve an equation that didn't add up. Eliza walked forward and the crowd parted. Not out of respect, not yet, but out of pure stunned confusion. This wasn't how the story was supposed to go. The humiliated girl was supposed to stay humiliated, stay broken, stay in her place. She wasn't supposed to return wearing something that made every other dress in the room look like a child's amateur attempt at fashion. Commander Thornton stood near the far wall, his expression unreadable behind his military bearing, but his eyes tracked Eliza's movement with the attention of a man reassessing a situation he'd thought he understood. Beside him, his wife, Caroline's mother, had her fan pressed to her lips, her eyes narrowed in calculation. The music started again, tentative at first, then stronger as the fiddler found his rhythm. A few couples resumed dancing, though their movements were distracted, their attention still caught on the impossible woman in deerskin who had walked back into a room that had tried to destroy her. "Miss Hart," a voice called out, and Eliza turned to see Thomas Brennan approaching, one of the young officers from the fort who'd always been polite enough but never quite brave enough to be kind. He stopped a respectful distance away and executed a small bow that looked genuinely courteous. "That's a remarkable dress. I don't believe I've ever seen craftsmanship quite like it." "Thank you," Eliza said, finding her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Mira Redbird made it. She's extraordinarily talented." She said it loud enough to carry, a deliberate choice. Mira had lived on the edges of this settlement for 3 years, her work admired in whispers but never acknowledged in public, as though praising her skill might somehow diminish the people who bought from the catalogs and considered themselves fashionable. Thomas's eyes flicked to Mira, who stood near the door with her arms crossed and an expression that suggested she was enjoying the show immensely. "Mrs. Redbird," Thomas said, including her in the conversation with visible effort, "you have a genuine gift." "I know," Mira replied, deadpan. "But it's nice to hear someone say it out loud for once." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the nearest onlookers. Thomas's ears went red, but he had the grace to look abashed rather than offended. "May I have this dance, Miss Hart?" he asked, extending his hand. Before Eliza could answer, Silas's grip on her arm tightened fractionally. Not possessive, more protective, like he was reminding her she didn't owe anyone anything, not even politeness. "That's kind of you, Lieutenant Brennan," Eliza said carefully, "but I believe this dance is already spoken for." She turned to Silas, whose expression suggested he'd been prepared to watch her dance with someone else and hated the idea with quiet intensity. "If you're willing," she added softly, just for him. Something in his face transformed. The hard edges that came from years of solitude gentled into something almost boyish, almost hopeful. "I haven't danced in near a decade," he warned. "Might step on your feet." "Then we'll match," Eliza said. "I haven't danced since I was a girl, and my father was still alive to partner me." Silas led her to the floor with the careful formality of a man who'd grown up knowing how to behave in polite company, even if he'd since forgotten why he should bother. The music shifted into a waltz, slower and more forgiving than the reels that had come before, and Silas placed one scarred hand at her waist, took her hand in his other, and began to move. He was right. He wasn't a good dancer. His steps were too measured, too cautious, like he was navigating dangerous terrain rather than a simple box step. But he held her like she was something precious, and his eyes never left hers, and somehow that made up for every fumbled turn. Around them, the room watched. Eliza could feel their attention like heat against her skin. Some of it was curiosity, the ordinary human impulse to witness something unexpected. Some of it was hostility, the resentment people feel when someone they've dismissed refuses to stay dismissed. And some of it, a small but growing portion, felt like reassessment, as though a handful of people in this room were beginning to wonder if they'd been looking at things wrong all along. "You're handling this better than I would," Silas murmured as he guided her through a turn that was almost graceful. "I'm terrified," Eliza admitted. "Doesn't show." "That's because I've had years of practice pretending I'm not." His hand tightened at her waist, a gesture of understanding or solidarity or both. "You shouldn't have had to learn that." "No," Eliza agreed. "But I did, and now I'm using it." The waltz ended and another began immediately, the musicians apparently deciding that momentum was safer than silence. Silas started to step back, to release her, but Eliza held on. "One more," she said. "Not a request. A claim." Silas smiled, a real smile, rare and transformative, and pulled her back into the dance. By the third waltz, other couples had joined them on the floor, the room's rhythm slowly returning to something resembling normal. But Eliza noticed that people were giving them space, a subtle circle of distance that marked them as either untouchable or dangerous. Maybe both. Caroline hadn't moved from her position near the punch bowl. She stood rigid as a fence post, her hands clenched at her sides, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. Millicent and Jane flanked her like nervous attendants waiting for orders that hadn't come yet. When the music paused between songs, Caroline finally moved. She crossed the floor with the kind of precise, controlled fury that came from a lifetime of being taught that ladies didn't make scenes but somehow always managed to make their displeasure known. She stopped 3 feet from Eliza and Silas, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough to maintain the pretense of civility. "That's quite a performance," Caroline said, her voice sugared venom. "Though I suppose when you're used to being a spectacle, adding a costume doesn't change much." "Caroline," her mother called from across the room, a warning note in her voice that suggested this was heading somewhere even Mrs. Thornton didn't want to go. Caroline ignored her. "Tell me, Eliza, did you have to beg the squaw to make that for you? Or did she take pity on you all on her own?" The word landed like a slap. Around them, several people inhaled sharply. Mira, still standing near the door, went very still in a way that made Eliza think of predators deciding whether to pounce. "Watch your mouth," Silas said, his voice dropping to something low and dangerous. "Why?" Caroline turned her attention to him with the kind of smile a snake might wear, if snakes could smile. "Are you going to defend your little charity case? How noble. Though I suppose it makes sense, outcasts do tend to find each other." "Caroline Thornton," Commander Thornton's voice cut through the room like a cavalry saber, sharp enough to draw blood. He strode across the floor, his military bearing radiating authority and barely contained anger. "That is enough. You will apologize to Mrs. Redbird immediately." "I will not," Caroline said, her chin lifting in defiance. "I said nothing that isn't—" "You will apologize," her father repeated, each word distinct and hard as iron. "Or you will leave this hall and spend the remainder of the evening in your quarters contemplating the difference between being an officer's daughter and behaving like one." The room had gone silent again, but this silence felt different, hungry, almost eager. People loved watching authority figures discipline their own, loved the small taste of justice that came from seeing privilege called to account. Caroline's face went through another series of transformations, ending on something that looked like humiliation wrapped in defiance. She turned to Mira with eyes that promised future retribution. "I apologize for my choice of words," she said, the apology so insincere it might as well have been an insult. "No, you don't," Mira said pleasantly. "But your father tried, and I appreciate that." Commander Thornton's jaw tightened. He gave Mira a nod that managed to convey both respect and regret, then turned back to his daughter. "You're dismissed, Caroline." "But, father—" "Dismissed." Caroline swept from the room with as much dignity as she could salvage, which wasn't much. Millicent and Jane followed like confused ducklings, their exit significantly less dramatic. The door slammed behind them hard enough to rattle the windows. Commander Thornton turned to Eliza, and for a moment she braced herself for another conflict. But his expression held something closer to weary apology than hostility. "Miss Hart," he said formally, "please accept my apologies for my daughter's behavior. It was inexcusable." "Thank you, Commander," Eliza replied, carefully neutral. He nodded once, then addressed the room at large. "Let's remember that this is supposed to be a celebration, shall we? Musicians, if you please." The fiddle started up again, this time launching into a lively reel that demanded movement and attention. Couples flooded the floor, grateful for the excuse to do something other than witness other people's conflicts. The volume of conversation rose, people processing what they'd just seen, spinning it into stories they'd tell tomorrow. Silas's hand found Eliza's again. "You want to leave?" he asked quietly. "We made the point. Showed them you couldn't be broken. Don't have to stay if you don't want to." Eliza looked around the room, at the dancers, at the decorations, at the celebration she'd dreamed of joining for 5 years. She'd won something tonight, proved something, but the victory tasted more complicated than she'd expected, bitter and sweet mixed together like medicine. "Not yet," she said. "I want one more dance, and then I want to walk out of here on my own terms, not because they chased me away." "Fair enough." They danced the reel, which was chaotic enough that Silas's lack of skill didn't matter much since everyone was just trying not to crash into each other anyway. Eliza found herself laughing, actual, genuine laughter, when Silas nearly collided with Thomas Brennan during a particularly complicated turn and had to grab a support beam to keep from taking out 3 other couples. "You warned me you couldn't dance," Eliza gasped between laughs. "I thought you'd assume I was being modest," Silas replied, looking both embarrassed and pleased that he'd made her laugh. Turns out, I was being accurate. By the time the reel ended, Eliza was breathless and warm and felt more alive than she had in months, maybe years. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be in her body without constantly monitoring how much space she took up, without calculating whether she was standing wrong or smiling wrong or existing wrong. The dress helped. The dress made her feel like she could take up exactly as much space as she needed, and it would be exactly right. Mira appeared at her elbow with a cup of punch. "Drink this before you pass out from exhaustion," she instructed. "I didn't spend an hour creating a masterpiece just to watch you collapse in it." Eliza drank gratefully, the punch sweet and cold and perfect. "Thank you," she said, and meant it for more than just the drink. "Thank you for what you made, for what you did." "I made a dress," Mira said with a shrug. "You're the one who walked back in here wearing it. Don't confuse my contribution with your courage." "It took both," Silas interjected. "Courage without the right tools fails just as sure as tools without courage to use them." "Listen to the mountain man getting philosophical," Mira teased, but her eyes were warm. "Next you'll be writing poetry." "I might," Silas said, so seriously that both women stopped and stared at him. "What?" "I can write poetry. Probably." "Have you ever written poetry?" Eliza asked. "No," Silas admitted. "But there's a first time for everything." The 3 of them stood together near the edge of the dance floor, watching the celebration swirl around them, and Eliza felt something shift in her chest. These 2 people, a reclusive mountain man and a Dakota craftswoman who lived on society's margins, had seen her when she was invisible, valued her when she was dismissed, and helped her stand back up when cruelty had knocked her down. That was worth more than 100 dances in 100 community halls. "I want to leave now," Eliza said. "But I want to do it properly. Walk out the front door, head high, like I belong anywhere I choose to be." "Then let's walk," Silas offered his arm again. This time Mira took Eliza's other arm, the 3 of them forming a united front as they made their way toward the exit. Conversations paused as they passed, heads turned, but Eliza kept her eyes forward and her spine straight. At the door, she paused and looked back one last time. The room looked smaller than it had an hour ago, the people less intimidating, the whole glittering celebration less important than she'd built it up to be in her imagination. She'd spent so many years believing that being included in this, in their parties, their conversations, their approval, would somehow validate her existence, make her real, make her worthy. What a waste of time that had been. Outside, the spring air was cold enough to bite, but after the stuffy heat of the dance hall, it felt clean and welcome. The stars were out in force, the kind of display that only happened when you were far enough from city lights that the sky could show off properly. "Thank you," Eliza said again, because the words felt inadequate but necessary. "Both of you, I don't know how I'll ever repay what you've done tonight." "Don't repay it," Mira said. "Pass it on. That's how these things work." "She's right," Silas agreed. "You help the next person who needs help, and they help the next one, and eventually the world's a little less cruel than it was before." They walked together through the quiet settlement, past dark buildings and sleeping horses, until they reached Mira's cabin. She paused at her door, one hand on the latch, and studied Eliza with eyes that seemed to see straight through to bone. "What will you do tomorrow?" Mira asked. "When the story of tonight has spread, and everyone's had time to sharpen their opinions about what happened?" It was a good question. Eliza hadn't thought past getting through tonight, past surviving the immediate crisis. Tomorrow felt impossibly far away and much too close at the same time. "I don't know," she admitted. "Then come see me in the morning," Mira said. I have an idea that might interest you, assuming you're willing to take a risk. What kind of risk? Mira's smile was sharp and knowing, the kind that turns a single night of courage into something permanent, something that lasts. She disappeared into her cabin before Eliza could ask what that meant, leaving her standing in the moonlight with Silas and a head full of questions. I should get you back to the store, Silas said. It's late, and folks will talk if you're out too long with just me for company. Let them talk, Eliza said, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. I'm done living my life according to what people might say. Silas's expression in the moonlight was impossible to read, but his voice came out rough with something that sounded like hope. Is that right? That's right. Eliza turned to face him fully, acutely aware that they were alone now, that the night had gone quiet around them, that he was standing close enough that she could see the rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. You said earlier that you've been watching me for 2 years. I did say that, Silas confirmed, looking like he was bracing for rejection. Why didn't you speak to me? Before tonight, I mean. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the mountains that loomed dark against the star-filled sky. When he finally answered, his voice was low and honest as winter. Because men like me don't approach women like you. Not in towns like this, where everyone's got opinions about who belongs with who. I live in the mountains 8 months out of the year. I smell like wood smoke and animal pelts. I don't have a proper house or steady income or any of the things a woman deserves from a man who comes courting. He paused, then added quietly, and I figured you had enough people judging you without adding me to the pile. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, Eliza said. Silas blinked. I'm sorry? You thought I'd care about houses and income and what people think? Eliza stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. After tonight, after you saw what those people with their nice houses and steady incomes did to me for entertainment, you thought I'd reject you because you live in the mountains? Well, when you put it like that, it sounds foolish, Silas muttered. It is foolish. Eliza reached out and took his hand, the one scarred from years of hard living, and held it between both of hers. You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see someone who spent an hour of his life performing a miracle for a woman he barely knew, who rode through the dark to find the perfect gift, who stood beside me when no one else would. That's worth more than 100 proper houses. Silas stared at their joined hands like he couldn't quite believe they were real. You mean that? I do. And she did. It was possibly the truest thing she'd ever said. Then, Silas cleared his throat, started again. Then would you consider letting me court you? Properly, I mean. I know I'm not around much, and I know it's not conventional, but I'd like to try. If you're willing. The request was so earnest, so vulnerable, that Eliza felt something crack open in her chest. All her life she'd been waiting for someone to see her as worthy, as valuable, as enough. And here was a man who'd seen her that way for 2 years without her even knowing, who'd proven it tonight with actions instead of empty words. Yes, she said simply. I'm willing. Silas's face transformed. The hard lines smoothed out. The guarded expression gave way to something open and young and almost painfully hopeful. He lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the gesture courtly and sweet and completely at odds with his rough appearance. I'll do right by you, he promised. I swear it. I know you will. They stood there in the moonlight, hands clasped, the weight of the evening settling around them like snow. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of the dance breaking up, voices calling goodbyes, horses being led from the corrals. The night was ending. Tomorrow was coming, ready or not. I should get back before Sarah sends out a search party, Eliza said reluctantly. I'll walk you. They made their way through the quiet settlement, moving slowly, neither quite ready for the night to end. At the back entrance to the general store, Silas stopped and released her hand with visible reluctance. When will I see you again? Eliza asked. I need to head back up to my camp tomorrow, check the trap lines before the weather turns. He looked frustrated by this fact, like the wilderness was suddenly an inconvenience instead of home. But I'll be back in town in a week, maybe less if I push it. A week. It felt like forever. Unless you need me sooner, Silas added quickly. If something happens, if those women cause you trouble, you send word and I'll come down immediately. I can handle Caroline Thornton, Eliza said with more confidence than she felt. I know you can, Silas agreed, but you don't have to handle her alone anymore. That's what having someone in your corner means. The concept was so foreign that Eliza had to pause and absorb it. Someone in her corner. Someone who would come running if she called. Someone who saw her struggles as his struggles because they were connected now, bound by something stronger than obligation. 1 week, she said. And Silas? Thank you for everything. Thank you for saying yes, he replied. That took courage too. He waited until she'd climbed the stairs and slipped through the door before turning and walking back toward the edge of town where he'd left his horse. Eliza watched from the window as his silhouette merged with the darkness, already counting the days until he'd return. The room she shared with Sarah was dark and quiet. Sarah's breathing from the other bed was deep and even. She'd apparently decided to skip the rest of the dance and turn in early, probably to avoid any second-hand embarrassment from being associated with Eliza. Eliza carefully removed the deerskin dress and hung it on a hook, running her fingers over the intricate beadwork one last time. In the morning, she'd need to figure out how to store it properly, how to care for something this precious. She crawled into bed still wearing her chemise, her body exhausted but her mind racing. The events of the night played through her memory like a stage show. The humiliation, the darkness, Silas's impossible promise, Mira's miracle, the walk back into that hall wearing armor made of leather and dignity. She'd expected to feel triumphant, victorious. Instead, she felt raw, exposed, like she'd shed a skin she'd been wearing for years and now everything touched her differently. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Tomorrow people would talk, would judge, would decide what tonight's events meant and how Eliza should be treated going forward. Caroline would plot revenge. Mrs. Thornton would calculate social strategies. The whole settlement would buzz with gossip and opinion. But tomorrow would also bring Mira's mysterious proposal, whatever risk she'd hinted at. And in a week, Silas would return. Eliza closed her eyes and let herself imagine it. A future that looked nothing like the one she'd been taught to want. No proper marriage to a proper man with a proper house in the proper part of town. Instead, something wild and real and entirely her own. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like the first deep breath she'd taken in years. Sleep came slowly, and when it finally arrived, it brought dreams of mountains and deerskin, of hands scarred from honest work, of dresses that moved like water, and women who refused to apologize for the space they occupied in the world. Morning arrived too early, announced by Sarah shaking her shoulder with unnecessary force. Eliza, wake up! You need to see this!" Eliza dragged herself out of sleep, disoriented and groggy. Sarah stood beside the bed holding a piece of paper, her face pale, her eyes wide. "What is it?" "It's from Mrs. Henderson," Sarah said, referring to the store owner's wife, technically Sarah's stepmother and Eliza's employer. "She wants to see you in her office immediately." And Eliza, Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "Half the town is already talking about last night. Some of it's good, but some of it, you need to be careful." Eliza sat up, her heart already racing. "What are they saying?" "That you made a spectacle of yourself. That you deliberately provoked Caroline. That you—" Sarah hesitated, then finished in a rush. "That you've been keeping company with the mountain man in ways that aren't appropriate for an unmarried woman." "That's ridiculous. He escorted me to a public dance." "I know that, you know that. But people will say what they want to say, and truth doesn't enter into it much." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, looking genuinely worried. "Mrs. Henderson sounded angry in the note. I think she might be planning to let you go." The words hit like cold water. Eliza's job at the general store was the only thing standing between her and complete destitution. She had no family, no savings to speak of, nowhere else to go. If Mrs. Henderson dismissed her, she'd be on the street within a week. "I'll get dressed," Eliza said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Tell her I'll be down shortly." Sarah squeezed her hand once, a gesture of solidarity, then fled. Eliza dressed quickly, braiding her hair with shaking fingers, trying to prepare herself for whatever was coming. She deliberately didn't wear the deerskin dress. That was armor for battles that required grand gestures. This was a different kind of fight, one that required different weapons. She chose her plainest dress, the one that made her look most like a respectable shop clerk, and hoped it would be enough. Mrs. Henderson's office was at the back of the store, a small room crammed with ledgers and inventory lists and the accumulated paperwork of running a frontier business. Mrs. Henderson herself sat behind a desk that seemed too large for the space, her mouth set in a thin line, her eyes cold. "Sit down, Eliza." Eliza sat, hands folded in her lap, and waited for the axe to fall. "I've received several complaints this morning," Mrs. Henderson began without preamble. "About your conduct at last night's dance, about the company you kept, about the—" She paused delicately. "Spectacle you created." "I was invited to a community dance," Eliza said carefully. "I attended with proper escort. I danced, I left. I'm not sure what about that warrants complaint." "Don't be deliberately obtuse, Mrs." Henderson's voice sharpened. "You provoked Caroline Thornton, one of the most prominent young women in this settlement. You made a scene that has the entire town talking, and you did it while wearing," she waved a hand dismissively, "savage clothing that reflects poorly on the standards this establishment tries to maintain." "Caroline destroyed my dress before I could even enter the hall," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "She and her friends tore it to pieces for their own amusement. The dress I wore afterward was a gift from Mrs. Redbird, and it was far more beautiful than anything Caroline was wearing." "That's your version of events." "It's the truth." Mrs. Henderson leaned back in her chair, studying Eliza with eyes that calculated profit and loss, reputation and risk. "Be that as it may, I cannot have an employee who causes this level of disruption. It's bad for business. Several of our better customers have already expressed their displeasure." "By better customers, you mean Mrs. Thornton?" "Among others." Mrs. Henderson pulled out a small envelope and laid it on the desk between them. "I'm giving you 2 weeks' severance and notice. You'll continue your duties until then, after which your employment here will be terminated. I suggest you use that time to make other arrangements." The envelope sat there like a death sentence. 2 weeks. 14 days to find new employment in a town where the commander's wife had marked her as undesirable. Eliza's hands clenched in her lap, nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks. She wanted to argue, to fight, to make Mrs. Henderson see the injustice of punishing the victim while the perpetrators faced no consequences. But she'd learned long ago that some battles couldn't be won with words. "Thank you for the notice," Eliza said quietly, taking the envelope with steady hands. "I'll make arrangements." She walked out of the office with her head high, made it through the store without crying, climbed the stairs to her room without breaking down. Only when the door was safely closed did she allow herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. She'd stood up to cruelty and won the night. But morning had brought consequences she hadn't anticipated, and now the small security she'd built was crumbling beneath her feet. Eliza looked at the deerskin dress hanging on its hook, at the evidence of her courage and her rebellion, and wondered if it had been worth it. Then she remembered Silas's face when she'd said yes to his courtship. Mira's fierce smile, the feeling of walking into that hall and refusing to be small. Yes, she decided, it had been worth it. Even if the price was higher than she'd known she was agreeing to pay. She tucked the severance envelope into her belongings, splashed cold water on her face, and headed back downstairs to finish her shift. She still had 2 weeks of wages coming, and she'd be damned if she'd give Mrs. Henderson any excuse to withhold them. But as she worked, restocking shelves, helping customers, keeping the ledgers that she wouldn't be keeping much longer, her mind was already spinning forward, trying to solve the impossible equation of her future. And in the back of her mind, Mira's words echoed like a promise or a dare. "I have an idea that might interest you, the kind that turns a single night of courage into something permanent." When her shift ended, Eliza didn't hesitate. She grabbed her shawl and headed straight for Mira's cabin, hope and desperation tangled together in her chest like thread wound too tight. Whatever Mira was offering, Eliza was ready to hear it. She had nothing left to lose, and the night had taught her that sometimes the most dangerous risks carried the sweetest rewards. Mira answered the door before Eliza could knock, as though she'd been watching from the window and waiting. Her expression gave nothing away, but her eyes swept over Eliza with the kind of assessment that missed nothing. "You look like someone just kicked your foundation out from under you," Mira observed, stepping aside to let her enter. "Mrs. Henderson gave me notice this morning," Eliza said, the words coming out flat and tired. 2 weeks and then I'm out. Caroline's mother made sure of it. Of course she did. Mira moved to her stove where coffee was already brewing, the scent rich and bitter in the small cabin. Power protects power. That's how these things work. The question is whether you're going to let them win or whether you're ready to build something they can't touch. She poured 2 cups and handed one to Eliza, gesturing for her to sit at the small table near the window. The morning light streaming through made the beadwork on display around the cabin glow like embers. "You said you had an idea," Eliza prompted, wrapping her hands around the warm cup and letting the heat seep into her cold fingers. "Something about turning last night into something permanent." "I did. I do." Mira settled into the chair across from her, cradling her own cup. "But before I explain it, I need to know something." "What do you want, Eliza Hart? Not what you think you should want, not what other people have told you to want. What do you actually want from your life?" The question caught Eliza off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. Her life had always been about survival, about making herself small enough to fit in spaces that didn't want her, about accepting whatever scraps of security and dignity she could manage to hold on to. "I don't know," she admitted. "Yes, you do." Mira's voice was firm but not unkind. "You just haven't given yourself permission to say it out loud." Eliza stared into her coffee, watching the steam rise and dissipate. What did she want? The question opened up something inside her that had been locked away for so long she'd forgotten it was there. When she finally spoke, the words came out raw and honest. "I want to matter," she said quietly. "I want to do something that means something. I want to wake up in the morning and know that my existence makes the world different somehow, even if it's just a small corner of it. I want to stop being invisible. I want—" She paused, the next part harder to voice. "I want to help women like me, the ones who don't fit, the ones who get told they're too much or not enough or wrong somehow just for existing the way they do." Mira's expression shifted into something that looked like satisfaction. "Good. That's what I thought you'd say, and it's exactly what I need to hear." She set down her cup and leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. "Here's what I'm proposing. You and I partner up. We create a business together, making clothes for real women. Not the catalog fantasies that require you to starve yourself and cinch your waist until your organs shift. Clothes like the dress I made you last night. Beautiful, well-crafted pieces that celebrate the bodies women actually have." Eliza's heart stuttered in her chest. That's a beautiful idea, but I don't have any money. I can sew basic things, but nothing like what you create. I don't know anything about running a business. I wouldn't know where to start." "You know bookkeeping," Mira countered. "You know how to talk to customers, how to manage inventory, how to keep records. Those are skills I don't have and don't particularly want to learn. As for money, I have some saved. Not much, but enough to get started if we're smart about it. And the sewing, I can teach you. You've got good hands and you already understand construction. The rest is just practice and technique." "But why me?" Eliza asked, trying to understand the angle, still waiting for the catch. "You could find someone with more experience, more capital, more connections." "Because you understand what we'd be fighting against." Mira's voice was steel-wrapped in certainty. "You know what it feels like to be dismissed because of how you look. You know the weight of judgment, the cost of not fitting into their narrow definition of acceptable. That understanding is worth more than money or connections. Besides," her expression softened slightly, "you're honest. You helped Silas when you didn't have to, when it cost you something to do it. You walked back into that dance hall when you could have run. You've got spine, Eliza Hart. That's what I need in a partner." The offer hung in the air between them, impossible and tempting and terrifying all at once. Eliza's mind raced through the practical obstacles. Where would they work? How would they find customers? What would happen when people like Mrs. Thornton made it their mission to destroy them? "We'd be pariahs," she said. "Once people realize what we're doing, once they understand we're deliberately rejecting their standards, they'll come after us with everything they have." "Yes," Mira agreed calmly. "They will. Are you afraid of that?" Eliza thought about the torn green dress lying in the corner of her room, about Mrs. Henderson's cold dismissal, about years of making herself smaller and quieter and less just to avoid exactly this kind of conflict. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "Good. Terror means you understand the stakes." Mira stood and moved to a trunk in the corner of the cabin, pulling out a leather portfolio that she laid on the table between them. I've been working on designs for 3 years. Sketches, patterns, ideas. I never had the courage to actually do anything with them because I knew I couldn't do it alone. But together, she opened the portfolio, revealing page after page of stunning designs. Together, we could build something extraordinary. Eliza leafed through the sketches with growing awe. Dresses that incorporated traditional Dakota beadwork with frontier practicality. Riding skirts that would actually allow a woman to sit a horse properly. Jackets with enough room in the shoulders for real work. Undergarments designed for comfort instead of torture. Each piece was beautiful and functional and revolutionary. These are incredible, Eliza breathed. They're nothing until someone makes them real. Mira closed the portfolio and looked at Eliza with challenge in her eyes. So what do you say? Are you ready to stop surviving and start building? The answer rose up from somewhere deep, from the same place that had made her walk back into that dance hall, from the part of her that was tired of apologizing for existing. Yes, Eliza said. Yes, I'm ready. Mira's face split into a genuine smile, rare and brilliant. Then we have work to do and not much time to do it in. You've got 2 weeks before your severance runs out. We need to be operational before then. That's impossible. So is making that dress in an hour. We seem to specialize in impossible. Mira was already moving, pulling out fabric samples, sketching notes, her hands moving with the quick efficiency of someone who'd been planning this for a long time and was finally getting to execute. First thing we need is a workspace. My cabin's too small. We need somewhere with room for cutting tables, storage, customer fittings. There's an old stable on the east side of the settlement, Eliza offered, her mind already racing ahead. It's been empty for 2 years since the owner died. His widow moved back east. I don't know who owns it now, but maybe we could rent it cheap. Find out. Mira handed her a piece of paper and a pencil. Write down everything you know about that space. Dimensions, condition, proximity to the main street. We'll need visibility, but not so much that we're an easy target for vandalism. Eliza started writing, the practical details helping to ground her racing thoughts. We'll need fabric, leather suppliers, thread, needles, shears, a way to take measurements, display forms. The costs are going to add up fast. I've got contacts for leather and traditional materials, Mira said, and some of the fabric we can get cheap if we're willing to work with what the catalog companies reject. Irregular weaves, odd colors, damaged bolts. We're not trying to compete with their perfect fantasy clothes anyway. We're offering something different. They worked through the morning, their planning interrupted only when Silas appeared at the door, looking travel-worn and worried. I was heading out to my camp when I heard, he said without preamble, his eyes finding Eliza immediately. About Mrs. Henderson. About you losing your position. I came back. You didn't have to do that, Eliza said, though warmth bloomed in her chest at the proof that he'd meant what he said about being in her corner. Yes, I did. Silas stepped into the cabin, his presence making the small space feel even smaller. I'm not leaving you to handle this alone. She's not alone, Mira interjected. We're starting a business, Eliza and I, making clothes for women who are tired of being told their bodies are wrong. Silas absorbed this information with the same steady calm he seemed to apply to everything. You'll need capital, security, probably legal documentation if you're going to do this properly. We're aware of the challenges, Mira said dryly. I have money. Silas said it simply, like he was commenting on the weather. 3 years of good trapping, and I don't spend much living up in the high country. If you need an investor, I'm offering. Eliza stared at him. Silas, we can't ask you to risk your savings on something this uncertain. You're not asking. I'm offering. There's a difference. He moved to the table, looking at the sketches spread across its surface. Besides, I've seen what you create, Mira, and I've seen how Eliza handles herself when the odds are against her. That's a better bet than most business ventures I could name. This isn't charity, Mira warned. If you invest, you're a partner. That means you have stake in the decisions and the profits, assuming we ever make any. Fair enough. Silas extended his hand. Partners, then. Mira shook it, then Eliza did the same, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip, the solid reality of someone choosing to believe in her when he had every reason not to. We're really doing this, Eliza said, half to herself. We're really doing this, Mira confirmed. Now sit down, both of you. We need to figure out exactly how we're going to turn 3 people with more courage than sense into a functioning business in 2 weeks. They spent the rest of the day planning. Silas went to investigate the old stable, returning with news that the widow's nephew owned it and was willing to rent it for a reasonable sum, mostly because no one else wanted the space and it was just sitting empty collecting dust. Mira drew up a list of immediate supply needs and began calculating costs. Eliza sketched out a basic business structure, drawing on her bookkeeping knowledge to create something that might actually work. By the time evening fell, they had the bones of a plan. It was fragile, held together by optimism and determination and not much else, but it was more than any of them had started with that morning. "I'll start moving my tools and supplies tomorrow," Mira said. "Silas, can you help with the heavy equipment? The cutting table alone weighs more than I can manage. I'll be here at dawn. And I'll go to the land office first thing to formalize the rental agreement," Eliza added. "The sooner we have legal standing, the harder will be to dislodge." They were just finishing when someone pounded on Mira's door hard enough to rattle the frame. All 3 of them froze. That kind of knocking never brought good news. Mira opened the door to find Thomas Brennan on the doorstep, still in his officer's uniform, his face flushed from running. "Miss Hart," he said, slightly breathless. "I'm glad I found you. You need to come quickly. There's trouble at the general store." Eliza's stomach dropped. "What kind of trouble?" "Fire," Thomas said grimly. "Started about 20 minutes ago in the back room. The one where you keep your belongings." Eliza was out the door and running before he finished speaking, her skirts hiked up around her knees, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, she could hear Silas and Mira following, but she didn't slow down. The general store was her whole life, her job, her home, everything she owned. The smell of smoke hit her 2 blocks away. By the time she reached the main street, she could see the flames licking through the upper windows, orange and hungry against the darkening sky. A bucket brigade had already formed, townspeople passing water from the well in a desperate attempt to contain the blaze. Mrs. Henderson stood in the street, wringing her hands, her husband shouting orders that no one was listening to. "Sarah!" Eliza grabbed the first person she saw. "Where's Sarah?" "She got out," the man said. "She's fine. But Miss Hart, your room—" Eliza didn't wait to hear the rest. She pushed through the crowd, ignoring the shouts telling her to stay back, and made it to the base of the stairs before strong hands grabbed her around the waist and hauled her backward. "Let me go!" She fought against Silas's grip. "My things are up there, everything I own." "You can't go up there," Silas said in her ear, his voice hard. "The stairs are already burning. You'd never make it." "But the dress, Mira's dress, is just a dress," Mira said, appearing at her other side. "You're not dying for a dress, no matter how good it was." Eliza watched helplessly as the flames consumed the upper floor, smoke billowing out in thick black clouds. Her room, her bed, her clothes, the small box of her mother's things she'd kept hidden under the floorboards, the severance envelope with 2 weeks' wages. All of it burning, turning to ash and memory. The deerskin dress. That hurt worst of all. The physical proof that someone had seen her as worthy, had spent an hour creating something beautiful just for her. Gone. "It was deliberate," Thomas Brennan said quietly from behind her. "The fire. Someone saw 2 men leaving out the back about 10 minutes before the smoke started. They were on horseback, moved fast, and were gone before anyone could get a good look at them." "You're saying someone set this fire on purpose?" Silas's voice had gone dangerously soft. "I'm saying it's suspicious, and I'm saying Miss Hart should be careful. Someone wanted to hurt her, and this," he gestured at the burning building, "was just a warning." Eliza felt Mira's hand slip into hers, squeezing tight. On her other side, Silas's presence was solid and furious. "Mrs. Thornton," Eliza said numbly. "Or Caroline, or both." "You don't know that," Thomas cautioned. "You can't prove it." "Don't need proof to know the truth," Mira said coldly. The bucket brigade eventually got the fire under control, but not before the entire upper floor was destroyed. The store itself survived, mostly, though the damage from smoke and water would take weeks to repair. Mrs. Henderson was weeping openly now, her husband's face gray with shock. Sarah found Eliza in the crowd, her face streaked with soot and tears. "I'm so sorry," Sarah sobbed. I tried to get to your room, but the smoke was too thick. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't. It's all right, Eliza said automatically, even though nothing was all right. You're safe. That's what matters. But your things were just things. The words felt hollow, but Eliza forced herself to mean them. Things could be replaced. Lives couldn't. She'd lost her job, her home, and all her possessions in the span of 12 hours. But she was still breathing. That had to count for something. You'll stay with me tonight, Mira said firmly. It's not much, but there's floor space and blankets. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. Eliza nodded, too exhausted to argue. She let Mira lead her away from the smoking ruins, from the crowd of onlookers, from the whole terrible scene. Silas walked on her other side like a guard, his eyes scanning the darkness for threats. Back at Mira's cabin, someone had left a basket on the doorstep. Inside were bread, cheese, dried meat, and a jar of honey. There was no note, but the message was clear enough. Someone in this town had seen what happened and wanted to help, even if they weren't brave enough to do it publicly. Eat, Mira commanded, putting the food on the table. Both of you can't fight battles on an empty stomach. Eliza ate mechanically, tasting nothing. Her mind kept circling back to the flames, to the calculated cruelty of burning someone's home as punishment for not staying in their place. Part of her wanted to give up, to leave Red Hollow entirely and start over somewhere else, somewhere people didn't know her story or care about her defiance. But that's what they wanted. Whoever set that fire wanted her gone, wanted her broken, wanted her to understand that resistance had consequences. I'm not leaving, Eliza said out loud, surprising herself. Mira looked up from her own plate. Good, because we've got a business to build and I'm not doing it without you. They tried to destroy you, Silas said carefully. They might try again. Then they'll fail again. Eliza straightened in her chair, feeling something hardening inside her chest. I spent years trying to make myself acceptable to people who were never going to accept me. I'm done with that. If they want to fight, they'll get one. But I'm not running. That's the spirit, Mira said with fierce approval. Though we should probably make sure our new workspace has decent locks and someone watching it at night. I'll sleep there, Silas offered. Until we're established enough that destroying us would cost more than it's worth. You can't live in a stable indefinitely, Eliza protested. I've lived in worse. Besides, it's temporary. Once we're making money, we can afford proper security. They talked through the logistics until late in the night, turning disaster into strategy, loss into motivation. By the time Eliza finally lay down on the blankets Mira had spread for her, she was too tired to do anything but fall immediately into dreamless sleep. She woke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke, sunlight streaming through the cabin window. Her body ached like she'd been in a fight. Her eyes felt swollen from smoke exposure, and she owned literally nothing except the clothes she'd been wearing when the fire started. It should have felt like the end of something. Instead, it felt like a beginning. Mira was already up and working, sorting through leather pieces and organizing tools. Good. You're awake. We've got the rental papers to sign today, supplies to order, and about 1,000 other things to do before sunset. How are you feeling? Angry, Eliza said honestly. And determined. Perfect. Anger's useful if you point it in the right direction. Mira handed her a cup of coffee. Silas went to the stable at dawn to start clearing space. We should join him soon as you're ready. Eliza drank the coffee in silence, staring at the sketches still spread across Mira's table. Beautiful clothes for real women. A business built on dignity instead of shame. A partnership forged in crisis and held together by shared purpose. They could do this. They would do this. She thought about the dress burning in the fire and felt a pang of loss so sharp it stole her breath. But the dress had served its purpose. It had shown her who she could be when she stopped apologizing for existing. That lesson didn't burn. That stayed. I'm ready, Eliza said, setting down her cup. Let's go build something. The old stable was in better condition than Eliza had expected, though that wasn't saying much. The roof had a few holes that needed patching, the floor was covered in years of accumulated dirt and straw, and the whole place smelled like horses and neglect. But the bones were good, solid walls, decent light from the windows, and enough space to set up a proper workshop. Silas had already cleared most of the debris into a pile outside and was working on sweeping the floor when they arrived. He looked up at their entrance, his face streaked with dust but his expression satisfied. It'll work, he said. Needs cleaning and some basic repairs, but the structure's sound. Give me a few days and I can make it habitable. We don't have a few days, Mira said, but her tone was practical rather than critical. We've got less than 2 weeks. We'll have to work and renovate at the same time. Then we better get started. They worked through the day with single-minded focus. Eliza went to the land office and signed the rental papers, using half of what remained of her severance as the first month's payment. Mira organized the space, marking out areas for cutting, sewing, storage, and customer fittings. Silas repaired the worst of the roof damage and reinforced the door locks, then rode out to his contacts to arrange for leather and material deliveries. By evening, the space looked less like an abandoned stable and more like the beginning of something real. "We need a name," Mira said, standing in the middle of the workshop with her hands on her hips. "Something that tells people what we're about without being preachy." "The Real Woman's Outfitter," Silas suggested. "Too wordy," Eliza said. "Hart and Redbird," Mira tried. "Sounds like a law firm." Eliza looked around the space, at the rough wooden beams and the light streaming through the windows, at the cutting table Silas had assembled from salvaged lumber. "What about just dignity? One word. Simple. It's what we're selling, really. Not just clothes, but the right to take up space without apology." Mira and Silas both went quiet, considering. "Dignity?" Mira repeated slowly. "I like it. It's direct, honest, impossible to misinterpret. And it'll make people like the Thorntons uncomfortable every time they have to say it," Silas added with a slight smile. "Which is a bonus." "Then dignity it is." Eliza felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness. Now we just need to make it real. The next week passed in a blur of exhausting work. Mira taught Eliza the finer points of leatherwork and advanced sewing techniques, her patience infinite when it came to craft, but non-existent when it came to self-doubt. Silas managed the heavy labor and supply runs, his steady presence keeping them grounded when the enormity of what they were attempting threatened to overwhelm. Eliza handled the business side, keeping meticulous records of every penny spent, every material purchased, every hour invested. They worked from dawn until well past dark, taking breaks only when exhaustion made their hands too shaky to hold needles. Silas slept in the back corner of the workshop as promised, though he spent most nights keeping watch rather than sleeping. Eliza stayed with Mira, the two women falling into an easy rhythm of shared space and shared purpose. The first dress they made together was a replica of the one that had burned, pale deerskin with intricate beadwork, designed to fit Eliza's body exactly as it was. Mira supervised while Eliza did most of the actual work, teaching her through repetition and correction. "You're getting better," Mira observed on the 5th day, watching Eliza place a line of beads with steady precision. "Your stitches are more even. Your tension's improved." "I have a good teacher," Eliza replied without looking up from her work. "You have good hands and the willingness to learn. That's more important than teaching." By the end of the first week, they had the dress finished and 3 other pieces well underway: a riding skirt with practical pockets, a jacket designed for actual work rather than decoration, and a simple day dress in a sturdy fabric that would survive frontier life. They also had their first customer. She came on a Tuesday afternoon, slipping through the door like she was doing something illicit. She was older than Eliza, maybe 35, with the broad shoulders and strong hands of someone who'd spent her life working hard. Her current dress strained across her back and hung too short, clearly made for someone smaller. "I heard about you," she said without preamble, her eyes darting around the workshop like she expected to be ambushed. "About what you're making here. About clothes for women who don't fit the regular sizes." "That's right," Mira said, setting down her work and approaching with calm confidence. "What do you need?" The woman's eyes filled with tears so suddenly it seemed to surprise her. "Something that fits," she whispered. "Just once. I want to wear something that was made for my body, instead of for some imaginary person I'll never be." Eliza felt something crack open in her chest. This was why they were doing this. Not to prove a point or win a battle, but to give women like this, like herself, the simple dignity of clothing that celebrated them instead of punishing them. "We can do that," Eliza said, moving to get her measuring tape. "We can absolutely do that." They measured her carefully, Mira calling out numbers while Eliza recorded them in their growing book of client specifications. The woman's name was Margaret, and she worked at the laundry on the edge of town. She wanted a dress for her daughter's wedding, something that would make her feel beautiful instead of ashamed. How much? Margaret asked when they'd finished, her voice tight with anxiety. I don't have much, but I've been saving. Mira named a price that was fair but not cheap, and Margaret's face fell. I can do half now and half when it's finished, she offered hesitantly. It'll take me a few weeks to get the rest together. That works, Eliza said before Mira could respond. They couldn't afford to extend credit, but they also couldn't afford to turn away their first real customer. Half now, half on delivery. We'll have it ready in 10 days. Margaret left half her payment and measurements for her dream dress, and when she was gone, Mira turned to Eliza with raised eyebrows. We're a business, not a charity, she said, but there was no real criticism in her voice. She'll pay, Eliza insisted. And even if she doesn't, we needed this. We needed proof that there are women out there who want what we're offering. One customer doesn't prove sustainability. It proves possibility. That's enough for now. By the end of the second week, they had 3 more customers, all women who'd heard whispers about the workshop on the edge of town, where you could get clothes that actually fit, where no one judged you for your size or shape, where the people doing the measuring understood what it felt like to be dismissed. Eliza's final day at the general store came and went with minimal fanfare. Mrs. Henderson handed over her final wages without comment, and Eliza walked out of that building for the last time with her head high, and her future uncertain but entirely her own. She went straight to dignity. The workshop had transformed over 2 weeks from an abandoned stable into something that looked almost professional. They had a sign now. Silas had carved it himself, the letters deep and clean, the wood treated to withstand weather. Display forms showed off their finished pieces. The cutting table was organized and efficient. They'd even managed to create a small fitting area with a curtain for privacy and a mirror salvaged from the ruins of the general store. We're official now, Mira said, looking around with satisfaction. Open for business. We're terrifying, Eliza countered. We've got 5 customers, minimal inventory, and everyone in town is waiting to see us fail. Then we won't fail, Silas said simply. He'd stayed the full 2 weeks, putting off his return to the mountains until they were stable. You've got the foundation. Now you build on it. When will you leave? Eliza asked, dreading the answer. Tomorrow morning. I need to get back before the weather turns. But I'll be down again in 3 weeks to check on things. Less if you need me. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You're going to be fine, Eliza. Better than fine. You're going to be extraordinary. That night, Mira discreetly made herself scarce, claiming she needed to visit a leather supplier on the far side of town. Eliza and Silas stood in the workshop surrounded by the physical evidence of what they'd built together, neither quite knowing how to say goodbye. Thank you, Eliza finally managed, for everything, for believing in this, for believing in me. Easiest belief I ever held, Silas replied. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. You know I meant what I said, don't you? About courting you properly. I know. 3 weeks is a long time. I'll be here when you get back. Promise me you'll be careful. That fire wasn't an accident, and people who'd burn down a building to make a point aren't going to stop just because you opened a shop. I'll be careful, Eliza promised. And Mira will be with me. We'll watch out for each other. Silas pulled her into his arms, the embrace fierce and protective and achingly brief. 3 weeks, he said against her hair. I'll count every damn day. He was gone before dawn, riding back into the mountains that had always been his refuge. Eliza watched from the workshop window until he disappeared into the trees, then turned back to the work that would fill the empty hours until his return. She and Mira threw themselves into production, working longer hours than were probably healthy, driven by the knowledge that they had to prove themselves viable before their critics could mobilize against them. More customers came, drawn by whispered recommendations and desperate need. Women who'd spent years being told their bodies were wrong, who'd tried to squeeze themselves into standards that didn't fit, who wept with relief when Mira told them they could have beauty without punishment. Every dress they made, every satisfied customer, every coin that went into their cash box felt like a small victory against the forces that wanted them to fail. But victories drew attention, and not all of it was welcome. The rock came through the window on a Thursday morning, wrapped in a note that said simply, "Leave while you still can." Glass scattered across the workshop floor like malicious snow, glittering in the early light. Mira swept it up without comment while Eliza read the note 3 times, her hands shaking with rage rather than fear. "Third one this week," Mira observed, dumping the glass into a bucket with more force than necessary. "They're getting bolder." The first had been painted words on their sign, crude insults that Eliza had scrubbed away before dawn so their customers wouldn't see them. The second had been their supply delivery mysteriously delayed, the wagon driver suddenly unwilling to make the trip after Mrs. Thornton had a word with his employer. Now this. "We need to report it," Eliza said, though even as the words left her mouth she knew how futile they were. "To who? Commander Thornton, whose wife is probably the one organizing this?" Mira shook her head. "We're on our own, Eliza. The sooner you accept that, the better. Then we board up the window and keep working. That's my girl." They'd just finished nailing boards across the broken window when Margaret arrived for her fitting, followed closely by two other customers who'd heard about Dignity through the quiet network of women who understood what it meant to finally have somewhere that saw them as human. The workshop filled with conversation and laughter, the sound of women being measured and consulted with real attention, and for a few hours the broken window felt less like a threat and more like proof that they were doing something that mattered enough to frighten people. Margaret's dress was nearly finished, a deep blue that brought out her eyes, cut to celebrate her strong shoulders rather than hide them. She stood in front of their salvaged mirror with tears streaming down her face. "I never thought I'd feel beautiful," she whispered. "I spent my whole life thinking that word wasn't meant for people shaped like me." "Then you spent your whole life listening to the wrong people," Mira said firmly, adjusting a seam with expert precision. "Beauty isn't a size. It's not a shape. It's just being fully yourself without apology." Margaret left with her dress carefully wrapped and the final payment in Mira's hands, and Eliza added the coins to their cash box with a sense of satisfaction that was becoming familiar. They were making it work. Slowly, barely, by the skin of their teeth, but they were making it work. The afternoon brought Anna Chen, whose family ran the dry goods store on the far edge of town. She was younger than most of their customers, maybe 19, and she moved with the careful control of someone who'd been mocked into hyper-awareness of her own body. "I heard you make clothes that actually fit," Anna said, her English heavily accented, her eyes darting nervously toward the door like she expected to be caught doing something forbidden. "We do," Eliza confirmed gently. "What do you need?" "A wedding dress." Anna's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I'm getting married in 2 months, and the dress my future mother-in-law ordered from the catalog is... It doesn't fit. She says I need to lose weight before the wedding, but I've tried, and I can't, and I don't want to spend my wedding day feeling like I'm wearing someone else's failure." Eliza's heart clenched. She knew that feeling, that specific shame of being blamed for your body's refusal to conform to someone else's expectations. "We can make you something beautiful," she said, "something that fits you exactly as you are right now. But Anna," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "your future mother-in-law isn't going to be happy about this." "I know?" Anna lifted her chin with visible effort. "But it's my wedding. For one day I want to feel like myself matters more than what other people think I should be. Then let's make that happen." They spent an hour taking measurements and discussing designs, Anna's eyes growing wider as Mira sketched possibilities that incorporated both frontier practicality and subtle nods to her family's traditions. By the time she left, Anna was smiling in a way that transformed her entire face, and Eliza felt that now familiar sense of purpose settling deeper into her bones. "We're going to catch hell for that one," Mira predicted after Anna had gone. "Her future mother-in-law is Frances Whitmore. She and Mrs. Thornton are thick as thieves. Then we'll catch hell." Eliza was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "But we'll do it knowing we gave that girl something she deserves." The weeks developed a rhythm despite the ongoing harassment. Broken windows, stolen supplies, customers being whispered about in church and excluded from social events for patronizing Dignity. But for every act of cruelty, there seemed to be a quiet counterbalance. Anonymous deliveries of fabric left on their doorstep, customers who came at dawn or dusk to avoid being seen, women who slipped them extra payment with notes saying, "For the next girl who can't afford it." Red Hollow was dividing around them, the fault lines becoming clearer every day. On one side stood the people who believed in maintaining order through exclusion, who thought that women who didn't fit the mold should keep trying until they broke. On the other stood a growing number of people who were tired of that particular cruelty, who saw what dignity represented and decided it was worth protecting. Silas returned exactly 3 weeks after he'd left, riding into town at sunset with saddlebags full of the finest leather Eliza had ever seen and a face that went tight with anger when he saw the boarded windows. "Who?" he asked simply, tying his horse outside the workshop. "Does it matter?" Mira replied. "Could be any of them, probably all of them taking turns. It matters because I need to know whose bones to break." "No breaking bones," Eliza said firmly, though her heart lifted at seeing him again, at the proof that he'd counted the days the same way she had. "We handle this by succeeding so thoroughly they can't ignore us anymore." Silas looked skeptical but didn't argue. He unpacked the leather, doe and elk in colors ranging from cream to deep brown, all of it supple and perfect, and presented it to Mira like an offering. "From a tanner I know up in Montana Territory," he said. "Best in 3 states. He owed me a favor." "This must have cost a fortune," Mira breathed, running her hands over the hides with reverent appreciation. "Consider it an investment in our partnership. Besides, I told him what you were doing and he wanted to help. Said his daughter spent her whole life being told she was too big to be pretty, and if you were fighting that fight, he wanted to supply your ammunition." Eliza felt something warm expand in her chest. They weren't as alone as it sometimes felt. There were people out there beyond Red Hollow's narrow boundaries who understood what they were building and wanted to see them win. That night, after Mira had gone to sleep and the workshop was quiet, Eliza and Silas sat together on the front step watching the stars emerge one by one. "I missed you," Eliza said softly. "Missed you too. Spent the whole 3 weeks arguing with myself about whether I should just stay here permanently. To hell with the trap lines." Silas's shoulder pressed against hers, warm and solid. "But you were right when you said you needed to prove you could do this without constant protection. Still hated every minute of being up there, knowing you were down here dealing with broken windows and threats. We're managing. I can see that. Doesn't mean I have to like it." He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "How are you really doing, Eliza? And don't give me the brave face you show everyone else. I want the truth." Eliza considered the question honestly. How was she doing? Some days she woke up terrified, convinced that this whole enterprise would collapse and leave her with nothing. Other days she felt invincible, like she and Mira were building something so right that the universe itself would bend to protect it. Most days existed somewhere between those extremes, a complicated mix of fear and hope and stubborn determination. "I'm tired," she admitted, "and scared. But I'm also more alive than I've ever been. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense." Silas reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "You're doing something that matters. That kind of work always costs something. The question is whether it's worth the price." "It is," Eliza said without hesitation. "Every time a woman walks out of that workshop standing taller than when she walked in, it's worth it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the settlement settle into sleep around them. Somewhere a dog barked, somewhere else a baby cried and was soothed. The ordinary sounds of ordinary lives, and Eliza felt the strangest sense of belonging, not to the town, but to this moment, this person beside her, this work she'd chosen. "I brought you something," Silas said eventually, reaching into his coat and pulling out a small wrapped package. "Wasn't sure if I should, given everything you've got going on, but I wanted you to have it anyway." Eliza unwrapped the package carefully to find a leather journal, the cover tooled with an intricate pattern of mountains and pine trees, the pages thick and creamy. "Thought you might want to keep track of things," Silas explained, suddenly sounding uncertain. "Your designs, customer notes, whatever. I know Mira keeps the business records, but this could be yours. For your thoughts, your ideas, the things you don't want to share with anyone else." Eliza turned the journal over in her hands, running her fingers across the tooled leather. It was beautiful and practical and so perfectly suited to who she was becoming that she felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you," she managed. "It's perfect." "You're welcome." Silas cleared his throat. "And Eliza, I know we agreed I was courting you, but we haven't exactly had time to do much courting, what with everything else going on. So I wanted to ask properly if you'd have dinner with me tomorrow night, just the 2 of us. Somewhere that isn't this workshop." Eliza's heart did something complicated. A real courtship dinner. The kind of normal thing that normal couples did in normal circumstances. Except nothing about their situation was normal, and she wouldn't have changed it for the world. "I'd love that," she said. "Good. I'll pick you up at sunset." He left shortly after, heading to the small boarding house where he'd taken a room for the duration of his visit, and Eliza sat alone on the step with her new journal in her lap. She opened it to the first page and, after a moment's thought, began to write. The words came slowly at first, then faster as she found her rhythm. She wrote about the dance, about the dress, about standing in the ruins of her old life and choosing to build something new. She wrote about Mira's fierce competence and Silas's steady faith, and the customers who walked through their door carrying years of shame and walked out carrying hope instead. She wrote until her hand cramped and the candle burned low, pouring everything onto the pages that were hers and hers alone. When she finally closed the journal and climbed into her makeshift bed in the corner of the workshop, she felt lighter somehow, like the act of naming everything had made it more real and less overwhelming at the same time. Morning brought 3 new customers before noon and a visit from Thomas Brennan, who arrived in civilian clothes looking uncomfortable. "Miss Hart, Mrs. Redbird," he greeted them formally. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "That depends on why you're here," Mira replied, not looking up from the jacket she was stitching. "I wanted to warn you. There's talk at the fort. Some of the officers' wives are planning something. I don't know what exactly, but Mrs. Thornton has been having meetings, and Caroline's been more insufferable than usual, which generally means she thinks she's about to win something." Eliza set down her measuring tape. "Why are you telling us this?" Thomas shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Because what happened at the dance wasn't right. What they did to you wasn't right. And I'm tired of watching good people get ground down by people who mistake cruelty for standards." He paused, then added, "My sister is a big woman. Bigger than you. She stopped leaving the house 5 years ago because she couldn't take the comments anymore. She just gave up. And when I saw you walk back into that hall wearing that dress, standing tall when you had every reason to run, I thought maybe if she'd had somewhere like this, maybe she wouldn't have given up." The raw honesty in his voice made Eliza's throat tight. "Thank you for the warning, Lieutenant. Thomas, and it's not just a warning. If you need anything, witnesses, statements, someone to verify that the harassment is real, I'll do it. I know it's not much, but it's something." After he left, Mira made a sound that was half laugh, half disbelief. "Well, didn't see that coming." "People surprise you sometimes," Eliza said. "They do. Question is whether one sympathetic officer is enough to counterbalance whatever the Thorntons are planning. Guess we'll find out." They didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, a notice appeared on the community board announcing a ladies' social and charitable auction to be held at the fort, organized by Mrs. Thornton and benefiting appropriate causes. The notice specifically mentioned that all respectable women of the settlement were invited to submit items for auction and attend the event. The emphasis on respectable was clearly deliberate. "They're trying to formalize the divide," Eliza realized, reading the notice for the 3rd time. "Make it official that some women are acceptable and others aren't. And anyone who patronizes dignity falls into the 2nd category," Mira finished. "Smart. Cruel, but smart." Several of their customers came by that afternoon in various states of distress, asking what they should do. Attend the auction and risk being publicly shamed for their association with dignity? Stay away and confirm their outcast status? "Go," Eliza told each of them. "Hold your heads high and go. Don't let them make you choose between our friendship and your place in this community. You deserve both." But privately, she and Mira knew what the auction represented. It was a line being drawn, a test being administered, a way of forcing people to declare which side they were on. And most people, when forced to choose between social acceptance and abstract principles, would choose acceptance every time. The night before the auction, Silas took Eliza to dinner at the small restaurant on the edge of town, a place humble enough that the Fort families didn't frequent it, but nice enough that it felt special. They sat at a corner table and ate venison stew and fresh bread while talking about everything except dignity and the Thorntons and the battle that was consuming Eliza's life. Silas told her about the mountains, about the particular quality of silence that existed above the tree line, about tracking elk through new snow and finding hot springs hidden in valleys that hadn't seen human footprints in years. Eliza told him about her childhood, About her father who'd been a surveyor and taught her to read maps and calculate distances, about her mother who'd died when she was 12 and left her with a bone-deep understanding of how quickly security could vanish. "That's why this matters so much to you," Silas said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "It's not just about the clothes or even about fighting the Thorntons. It's about building something that can't be taken away." "Maybe," Eliza admitted. "Is that foolish? Thinking I can build something permanent in a world that's proved over and over that nothing lasts?" "No. It's human. We all want to leave something behind, some proof that we existed and that our existence mattered." He reached across the table and took her hand. "And for what it's worth, I think you're building something that will last. Not because it's permanent, nothing is, but because you're teaching women to stand up for themselves. That's a lesson that spreads. Your customers will teach their daughters, who will teach their daughters, and somewhere down the line there will be women standing tall who never even heard your name but are standing on the foundation you laid." Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes. "That's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever said to me." "It's just the truth." Silas's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "You're extraordinary, Eliza Hart. I think I knew that the first time I saw you slip me that package 5 years ago, but I'm absolutely certain of it now." They walked back to the workshop slowly, taking the long route, neither ready for the evening to end. At the door, Silas pulled her into his arms and kissed her. Really kissed her. Not the careful courtship pecks they'd exchanged before, but something deep and claiming and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Silas rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I know it's fast. I know we've got 100 problems to solve before we can think about a future, but I needed to say it. I love you." Eliza's heart felt too big for her chest. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have for a while now. Maybe since the moment you promised me an hour and then made the impossible happen." They stood there in the moonlight, holding each other, and for a few perfect minutes the world narrowed to just the two of them and the future they were beginning to imagine together. The auction arrived on a Saturday, the fort decorated with bunting and flowers, tables laden with donated items ranging from quilts to preserves to hand-carved furniture. Half the settlement turned out, dressed in their best clothes, ready to see and be seen. Eliza watched from his workshop window as her customers walked past. Margaret in her beautiful blue dress, Anna Chen with her head held high, others whose faces had become familiar over the past weeks. "Should we go?" she asked Mira. "Absolutely not. We weren't invited, and showing up would just give them ammunition. Besides, we have work to do." They spent the afternoon finishing Anna's wedding dress, a creation of cream-colored leather and silk that managed to be both traditional and revolutionary. The bodice was fitted but comfortable, the skirt full enough for movement, the whole thing decorated with delicate embroidery that incorporated both frontier flowers and Chinese symbols for happiness and prosperity. "She's going to cry when she sees this," Eliza predicted, stepping back to admire their work. "She better. I didn't spend 40 hours on embroidery for a mild reaction." They were just packing the dress carefully in tissue paper when the door burst open and Margaret stumbled in, her face flushed with anger and her blue dress torn at the shoulder. "Those absolute vipers," she spat, breathing hard. "They planned it. The whole thing was a setup." "What happened?" Eliza helped her to a chair while Mira got water. "Mrs. Thornton stood up during the auction and made a speech about maintaining community standards, about how certain elements were trying to undermine the proper social order by encouraging women to reject modesty and restraint. She didn't name dignity directly, but everyone knew what she meant. Then Caroline started passing around sketches, terrible, deliberately ugly caricatures, claiming they were examples of what you were making here. Making it look like you were dressing women like savages, Mira supplied dryly. "Let me guess. She particularly focused on my involvement and made sure everyone understood I was corrupting good Christian women with my heathen influences." Margaret nodded miserably. "Several women who've been your customers stood up to defend you. Anna Chen, bless her heart, actually told Mrs. Thornton that she was getting married in a dignity dress and was proud of it. But Mrs. Thornton just smiled and said that was very unfortunate, and perhaps Anna should reconsider whether she wanted to start her marriage by publicly rejecting her new family's values." "And then what happened?" Eliza asked, though she could already guess. Mrs. Whitmore, Anna's future mother-in-law, stood up and said if Anna insisted on wearing that dress, the wedding would be postponed until she came to her senses. Anna tried to argue, but her fiancé just sat there saying nothing, and eventually Anna ran out crying. I followed her to make sure she was all right, and that's when Caroline and her friends cornered me. Margaret's hand went to her torn shoulder. They didn't hit me. They're too smart for that. But they made sure I understood that continuing to associate with you would have consequences. That my daughter's wedding would suddenly find itself without a venue. That the laundry might lose its contracts with the Fort families. That I could choose you or my livelihood. What did you tell them? Eliza asked quietly. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I told them to go to hell, and then I came here because I figured you should know what's happening, and because I need to know if you can fix my dress. I'm not letting those bitches win. Mira was already moving, examining the torn shoulder with expert eyes. 10 minutes. Sit still. While Mira worked, Margaret told them the rest. How several other customers had been similarly cornered and given the same choice. How Mrs. Thornton had announced a new social club for ladies of quality that would meet weekly and organize community events, with membership by invitation only. How the division they'd feared was now formalized, lines drawn and sides chosen. Some of your customers are going to stop coming, Margaret said bluntly, not because they don't believe in what you're doing, but because they can't afford the social cost. I'm sorry, but that's the reality. I know, Eliza said. And she did. She'd always known that asking women to choose principles over security was asking for something most people couldn't afford to give. Mira finished the repair and helped Margaret back into her dress. There, good as new. Better, actually. I reinforced the whole shoulder. Margaret hugged them both fiercely. I meant what I said. They're not going to break me. I've spent too many years being broken by people like them. I'm done. After she left, Eliza and Mira sat in silence for a long moment. This is bad, Mira finally said. Yes. We're going to lose customers, probably money, maybe the whole business if enough people fold. Yes. And you're still not willing to give up? No. Eliza lifted her chin. We knew this would get worse before it got better. We just have to survive long enough to prove we can't be destroyed. That's either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. The next week tested that resolve to its limits. 3 customers sent notes canceling their orders, apologetic but final. 2 more stopped coming to their fittings without explanation. The supply wagon that had finally started making deliveries again suddenly refused their business, and they had to scramble to find alternative sources at higher prices. But for every customer they lost, they gained unexpected support from strange quarters. The tanner in Montana sent another shipment of leather with a note saying it was on extended credit. A fabric merchant from 3 towns over showed up at their door, saying he'd heard about what they were doing and wanted to supply them at cost. Thomas Brennan started quietly steering officers' daughters who were tired of their mother's rigid standards toward dignity, though he did it carefully enough that it couldn't be traced back to him. And Silas, who'd planned to stay only a week, kept finding reasons to delay his return to the mountains. He fixed their roof, reinforced their locks, sat outside at night making sure no one tried to burn them down the way they'd burned down Eliza's room at the general store. You're going to lose your whole trapping season if you stay much longer, Eliza pointed out one evening, feeling guilty about the sacrifice, even as she was grateful for it. Season's already half gone anyway. Might as well stay and make sure you survive to see the next one. He was carving something from a piece of pine, his hand steady and sure. Besides, I've been thinking about maybe settling down a bit. Spending more time in town, less time isolated in the mountains. I'm not getting any younger, and there's things down here worth staying for. He looked at her when he said it, and Eliza felt warmth bloom in her chest. Things? She asked, deliberately teasing. One thing in particular. He set down his carving. She could see now that it was a small bird, wings spread, and crossed to where she sat at the cutting table. One person, actually. A woman who's braver than she knows and more beautiful than she believes, and who I can't imagine living without anymore. Eliza's breath caught. Silas, I know this isn't the right time. I know we're in the middle of a battle, and you're building a business, and the last thing you need is another complication. But I need to say it anyway because life's too short and too uncertain to wait for perfect moments. He took her hand, his grip warm and solid. Marry me, Eliza. Not today? Not tomorrow. But someday, when things settle down and you're ready, marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice. Eliza stared at him, her mind spinning. Marriage, a future, the kind of permanent commitment she'd thought was forever out of reach for women like her. I don't have a dowry, she said, because her brain was apparently determined to focus on practical obstacles rather than the enormity of what he was offering. I don't have property or savings or anything a wife is supposed to bring to a marriage. I don't want your dowry. I want you, your courage, your kindness, your stubborn determination to make the world better even when it fights you every step of the way. That's worth more than any amount of property. I'm not easy to live with. I'm opinionated and emotional, and I take up a lot of space. Good. I like women with opinions, and you should take up space. You should take up all the space you need and never apologize for it. Eliza felt tears spill over, but they were good tears, happy tears, the kind that came from being seen so completely that there was nowhere left to hide. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. Someday when things settle down and we've won this fight and dignity is stable and... He kissed her, cutting off her list of conditions, and she melted into it, into him, into the promise of a future that included both the work she loved and the man who loved her exactly as she was. When they finally broke apart, Mira was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and an expression of amused exasperation on her face. Are you two finished being disgustingly romantic? Because we have a wedding dress to deliver to Anna Chen tomorrow, and I'd like to actually finish it before we all die of old age. Eliza laughed, wiping her eyes. We're finished. Good. Then get over here and help me with this beating. And Silas, congratulations. You're marrying the best woman in Wyoming territory. Try not to screw it up. Yes, ma'am, Silas said, grinning like a fool. They worked late into the night, the three of them together, finishing Anna's dress and planning for a future that was uncertain but entirely theirs. Outside, the settlement slept, unaware that in a converted stable on the edge of town, three people were building something that would outlast all the Thorntons and all their cruelty. Something called dignity. Something called hope. Something called home. Anna Chen's wedding day arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that seemed designed to mock human drama. The sky was impossibly blue, wildflowers dotted the fields surrounding Red Hollow, and the air carried the scent of pine and possibility. Eliza stood in the workshop at dawn with Anna's wedding dress laid out on the cutting table, the cream leather and silk catching the early light like something out of a dream. Anna arrived 2 hours before the ceremony with her mother, both women's faces tight with anxiety. Mrs. Whitmore said if I wear this dress, she'll cancel the wedding, Anna said without preamble, her voice shaking. She said my fiancé won't marry me if I insist on humiliating his family. She said, her voice broke. She said I have to choose between the dress and the marriage. Eliza's heart sank. This was exactly what the Thorntons had wanted, to force their customers into impossible choices, to prove that Dignity's promises were hollow when confronted with real consequences. What did your fiancé say? Mira asked quietly. Nothing. He just stood there while his mother talked. He won't stand up to her. He never has. Tears streamed down Anna's face. I love him, but I don't know if I can marry someone who won't defend me. And I don't know if I can give up this dress because it's the only thing I've ever worn that made me feel like myself. Her mother spoke for the first time, her English halting but fierce. My daughter should not have to choose. She should have both, the husband and the respect. But this is not the world we live in. Eliza looked at the dress, at Anna's tear-streaked face, at the impossible situation that was playing out exactly as their enemies had planned. She thought about all the women who'd walked through their door carrying years of shame, about Margaret standing up to Caroline despite the cost, about her own journey from humiliation to defiance. And she made a decision that was either brilliantly brave or catastrophically stupid. Wear the dress, Eliza said. But wear the dress to the ceremony. Walk down that aisle looking exactly like yourself. And let your fiancé decide what matters more, his mother's approval, or the woman he claims to love. If he chooses his mother, then you've learned something important before you tied your life to his. And if he chooses you, if he stands up for you in front of everyone, then you've got the beginning of a real partnership. And if he cancels the wedding, Anna whispered, Then you walk out of that church with your head high, knowing you didn't compromise yourself for someone who wasn't willing to fight for you. Eliza took Anna's hands. I know that's easy for me to say when it's not my wedding, not my future on the line. But Anna, I've spent my whole life making myself smaller for people who were never going to accept me anyway. It never worked. It just made me disappear. Don't disappear on your wedding day. Anna looked at her mother, who nodded slowly. Your father would tell you the same. He married me when his family said no, when they told him he was making a mistake. He chose me anyway. You deserve a husband who chooses you. All right, Anna said, her voice strengthening. All right, I'll wear it, and we'll see what kind of man I'm marrying. They helped her into the dress, Mira and Eliza working together to settle the fabric perfectly, to arrange her hair with small flowers woven through the dark strands, to make sure every detail was exactly right. Anna's mother added a jade pendant that had belonged to her grandmother, the green stone resting against the cream leather like a blessing. When Anna looked at herself in the mirror, she stopped breathing. I look like myself, she said wonderingly. I look like me, but more, better. Like the version of myself I always hoped I could be. That's because you are that version, Mira said firmly. The dress just helps other people see what was always there. They walked to the church together, Eliza, Mira, and Silas flanking Anna and her mother like guards or witnesses, or both. Word had apparently spread that Anna was defying Mrs. Whitmore because the street was more crowded than usual, people emerging from shops and homes to watch the procession pass. Some faces showed support. Others showed disapproval. Most showed simple curiosity about what would happen when the two forces collided. At the church entrance, Mrs. Whitmore waited with Caroline Thornton at her side, both women wearing expressions of righteous fury. Behind them stood Anna's fiancé, a young man named James, whose face was pale but unreadable. You cannot enter this church wearing that, Mrs. Whitmore announced, loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. It's inappropriate, disrespectful, and if you persist in this foolishness, there will be no wedding today. Anna's step faltered, but her mother squeezed her arm and she kept walking forward. This is my wedding dress, Anna said, her voice carrying despite its tremor. Made by skilled craftswomen who treated me with respect. I'm wearing it, and if that's a problem, then perhaps we need to discuss what kind of family I'm marrying into. James, Mrs. Whitmore turned to her son. Tell her she needs to change, or there's no wedding. Every eye turned to James, who stood frozen in the doorway looking between his mother and his bride. The silence stretched out, painful and absolute. Eliza could see the calculation on his face, the weighing of loyalties, the moment of choice that would define everything that came after. Mother, James said finally, his voice quiet but steady, I'm going to marry Anna today, in that dress or any other dress she chooses to wear. And if you can't accept that, then you're welcome to leave, but the wedding will happen with or without your approval. Mrs. Whitmore's face went through several colors before settling on a furious red. You ungrateful! I'm grateful for everything you've done for me, James interrupted, speaking over her for perhaps the first time in his life. But I'm marrying Anna because I love who she is, not who you think she should be. That includes respecting her choices, even when they're not the choices you would make. He stepped forward and took Anna's hand, and the smile that broke across her face was bright enough to rival the sun. That dress is beautiful, James said softly, just for her. You're beautiful. I'm sorry I didn't say it sooner. Mrs. Whitmore made a strangled sound and turned on her heel, storming away from the church with Caroline hurrying after her. Several other Fort families followed, a small exodus of people who apparently couldn't stomach the idea of attending a wedding where the bride had defied proper social order. But most people stayed. And when James led Anna into the church, still holding her hand, still choosing her, the crowd that had gathered broke into spontaneous applause. Eliza felt tears on her cheeks and didn't bother wiping them away. Beside her, Mira was smiling like a warrior who'd just won a crucial battle, and Silas's arm came around her waist, pulling her close. You did that, he murmured in her ear. You gave her the courage to be herself. She had the courage already, Eliza replied. We just gave her the dress to do it in. They didn't attend the actual ceremony, they hadn't been invited, and their presence would only cause more conflict, but they stood outside with a handful of other townspeople who'd chosen to show support in whatever way they could. When Anna and James emerged as husband and wife, Anna still wearing her dignity dress, and James looking at her like she'd hung the moon, the applause was genuine and warm. Anna found Eliza in the crowd and hugged her fiercely. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for seeing me, for believing in me, for making me believe in myself." "Be happy," Eliza whispered back. "That's all the thanks we need." The wedding became a turning point. Within a week, 5 new customers appeared at Dignity's door, all of them referencing Anna's dress and asking if they could have something similar. 2 were Fort daughters tired of their mother's restrictions. One was a rancher's widow who'd spent years in shapeless mourning clothes and wanted something that made her feel alive again. The others were women who'd been quietly watching the battle play out and had decided which side they wanted to be on. "We're going to need more space," Mira observed, looking at the growing pile of orders. "And probably help. I can't keep up with this volume alone, even with Eliza learning fast." "There's another stable 2 buildings down," Silas offered. "Bigger than this one. The owner's looking to sell because he's moving his operation to better grazing land. I could buy it, and we could expand." "That's a huge investment," Eliza cautioned. "So was the leather. So was staying in town instead of trapping. I'm already invested, Eliza. Might as well invest properly." He paused, then added, "Besides, if we're getting married, we'll need somewhere to live. The stable has rooms above it that could be converted into living quarters. We could have the business on the ground floor, home above. Keep everything together." Eliza's mind was already racing ahead, imagining the possibilities. More space meant more customers. More customers meant more impact. More women helped. More proof that their model worked. And living above the shop would save money while keeping them close to their work. "Let's do it," she said. They purchased the larger stable with Silas's savings and a small loan from the tanner in Montana who'd become an unexpected ally. The expansion took a month of hard work, every spare moment spent renovating and organizing. Thomas Brennan helped with the heavy lifting, bringing 2 other young officers who were quietly sympathetic to their cause. Margaret and several other customers volunteered their time, painting walls and building shelves and turning the raw space into something functional and beautiful. The day they opened the expanded Dignity was warm and bright, and the line of customers stretched out the door. Women came from Red Hollow and beyond, some traveling 2 days just to be measured for clothes that would actually fit their bodies. Eliza and Mira worked until their fingers were numb, taking measurements and discussing designs and promising delivery dates that seemed impossible, but somehow they'd figure out how to meet. They hired their first employee that week, a young woman named Beth, who'd been dismissed from her position as a seamstress at the fort for being too slow, which really meant too fat to meet Mrs. Thornton's standards. She cried when they offered her the job, when they told her that her size was irrelevant and her skill was everything. "You mean it?" she asked, like she couldn't quite believe it. "You'll really hire me even though you're what?" Mira interrupted. "Talented, hardworking, exactly what we need? Yes, we'll hire you despite those terrible qualities." Beth laughed through her tears and started the next day. The Thorntons didn't give up, of course. They continued their campaign of social pressure and subtle sabotage, but it became increasingly ineffective as Dignity's reputation spread. Women began traveling from other settlements specifically to purchase their clothes, and word reached larger towns about the frontier workshop that was revolutionizing how women dressed and how they thought about their bodies. A newspaper reporter from Denver showed up one afternoon, a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria Mills, who wanted to write a story about the rebellion happening in Red Hollow. She interviewed Eliza and Mira for 3 hours, asking pointed questions about their philosophy, their business model, and what they hoped to achieve. "We're not trying to start a revolution," Eliza explained. "We're just trying to make clothes that fit real women and treat them with dignity. If that's revolutionary, it says more about society's standards than it does about us." "But you are challenging those standards," Victoria pressed. "You're telling women they don't have to conform to a particular shape or size to deserve beauty. That's radical." "It shouldn't be," Mira interjected. "Treating people with basic respect shouldn't be radical. The fact that it is just proves how broken the system was to begin with." The article appeared 2 weeks later, complete with sketches of their designs and quotes from satisfied customers. It was fair and honest and made Dignity sound exactly like what it was. A business built on the revolutionary idea that all women deserved to be seen and celebrated exactly as they were. Orders flooded in from across the territory and beyond. They hired 2 more seamstresses and a young man named Peter, whose job was solely to manage supplies and deliveries. The workshop that had started as a desperate partnership between 2 outcasts became a thriving enterprise, employing 6 people and serving hundreds of customers. Eliza married Silas on a cool autumn morning, wearing a dress she and Mira had created together, deep green leather that reminded her of the forest, decorated with beadwork that told the story of her journey from humiliation to hope. The ceremony was small, held in the workshop with their employees and closest friends as witnesses. Thomas Brennan stood as Silas's best man, and Mira served as Eliza's attendant. And when they spoke their vows, it felt less like making promises and more like acknowledging truths that had already existed. "I promise to see you," Silas said, holding her hands and looking at her with such naked love that it made her heart ache. "To really see you every day for the rest of my life. To celebrate who you are and support who you're becoming. To stand with you and beside you and occasionally behind you when you're leading the charge, which will be most of the time." "I promise to let you," Eliza replied, her voice thick with emotion. "To stop hiding and start trusting. To build a life with you that's big enough for both of us and all the dreams we haven't dreamed yet. To love you exactly as you are while we both keep becoming more." Well, they kissed while their friends cheered, and Eliza felt something settle deep in her bones. A sense of rightness, of finally being exactly where she belonged, with exactly who she belonged with. The celebration afterward was simple but joyful. The workshop decorated with fall flowers and filled with people who'd become family through choice rather than blood. Margaret brought food, Anna and James brought wine. Beth organized games that had everyone laughing until their sides hurt. Even Commander Thornton made a brief appearance, offering formal congratulations in a way that suggested he'd finally accepted that they weren't going anywhere. His wife and daughter, notably, did not attend. "They're still out there," Mira observed later that evening, watching the party from the edge of the room. "Still angry, still plotting. This isn't over." "No," Eliza agreed, "but we're stronger now. We have people, resources, proof that our way works. They can't break us the way they could have 6 months ago." "So what do we do about them?" Eliza thought about Caroline's cruelty, about Mrs. Thornton's calculated campaign to destroy them, about all the small and large ways they'd tried to force dignity to fail. Part of her wanted revenge, wanted to see them publicly shamed the way they'd shamed so many others. But a larger part of her was simply tired of giving them power through her attention. "We ignore them," she said finally. "We keep building what we're building, keep helping the women who need help, keep proving every day that their version of the world doesn't have to be the only version. That's the best revenge. Success so complete they can't deny it even when they try." As if to prove her point, Anna approached with news that she was expecting her first child and wanted Mira to design clothes that would accommodate her changing body without hiding it. Margaret came right behind her asking about a riding outfit that would let her finally learn to sit a horse properly. Beth shyly requested help designing a dress for her first real courtship, with a man who saw her skill and kindness rather than her size. These women and dozens like them were the answer to the Thorntons' cruelty. Every life dignity touched, every woman who walked out standing taller, every child who would grow up seeing their mother celebrated rather than shamed. That was the legacy being built, one stitch at a time. 3 years later, Eliza stood in the now massive workshop watching her employees work. They'd expanded twice more, taking over the entire block, employing 23 people and serving customers from across 3 territories. Dignity had become more than a business. It was a movement, a philosophy, a living proof that different standards were possible. Mira was training their newest hire, demonstrating the particular technique she used for beadwork that made each piece unique. Beth was managing the customer fitting area with quiet confidence, no longer the uncertain girl who'd cried when they hired her. Silas was at the cutting table working on furniture orders. He'd started a side business making chairs and tables designed for larger bodies after watching too many of their customers struggle with standard furniture. And Eliza sat at the desk they'd installed in the corner, managing the books and the correspondence and the constant stream of requests from women asking if they could open similar shops in their own towns. She'd started writing back with advice and encouragement, helping others build their own versions of dignity, spreading the model beyond what she and Mira could personally achieve. Her hand rested on her stomach, where her first child was just beginning to show. She and Silas had spent long hours talking about what it would mean to raise a daughter in this world, how they could give her the confidence and self-love that Eliza had to fight so hard to find, or a son who would need to learn early that women's worth wasn't measured by their appearance or their compliance. Either way, their child would grow up knowing that their mother had helped change a small corner of the world, had turned humiliation into power and loneliness into love, and one terrible night into the foundation of something extraordinary. The door opened and Caroline Thornton walked in. The workshop went quiet, everyone recognizing the woman who'd caused them so much trouble in the early days. Caroline was older now, the sharp edges of her beauty beginning to soften into something less certain. She stood in the doorway looking around with an expression Eliza couldn't quite read. "Can I help you?" Eliza asked, keeping her voice neutral. Caroline's eyes found hers across the room. "I'd like to order a dress." The statement was so unexpected that Eliza just stared at her for a long moment. "Why?" "Because I need one." Caroline stepped further into the workshop, her movements uncertain in a way that was completely unlike the confident cruelty Eliza remembered. "And because everyone says you make the best clothes in the territory, and because—" She paused, something vulnerable crossing her face. "Because I'm getting married, and I want a dress that makes me feel like myself instead of like the person everyone expects me to be." Mira appeared at Eliza's side, her expression skeptical. "You destroyed Eliza's dress for fun. You tried to ruin our business. You made dozens of women's lives miserable just to prove you could. And now you want our help?" "I know." Caroline's voice was quiet. "I know what I did. I know I don't deserve your help. But I'm asking anyway because I don't know where else to go. My mother has very specific ideas about what my wedding dress should look like, and none of those ideas include what I actually want. And I'm tired." Her voice broke slightly. "I'm so tired of pretending to be someone I'm not, just to make other people happy." Eliza studied her, looking for the trick, the angle, the hidden cruelty. But all she saw was a woman who looked exhausted and uncertain, and maybe, possibly, genuine. "Who are you marrying?" she asked. "Thomas Brennan. We've been courting for 6 months. He says—" Caroline smiled slightly. "He says I'm much nicer when I'm not trying to impress my mother. He says he likes the person I am when I stop performing." Thomas Brennan, the officer who'd warned them about the auction, who'd helped them renovate, who'd quietly stood against his own social class to support what they were building. Of course, he'd be the one to see past Caroline's armor to whatever real person existed underneath. "What kind of dress do you want?" Mira asked, and Eliza recognized the question for what it was. A test, a way of determining if this request was genuine or another form of attack. Caroline described something simple and elegant, free of the excessive decoration her mother favored, designed for movement and comfort rather than display. As she talked, her whole demeanor changed, becoming younger and more genuine, and Eliza saw glimpses of the person Caroline might have been if she'd grown up with different lessons. "We can do that," Eliza said finally, "but I need to know why you really came here. Why not go to any of the dressmakers who would be happy to serve the commander's daughter?" Caroline was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because Thomas told me what you said once, about how everyone deserves to take up exactly as much space as they need without apology. And I realized I've spent my whole life trying to take up the right amount of space according to other people's measurements, and I don't even know what my actual size is anymore. I thought maybe—" She met Eliza's eyes directly. "I thought maybe if you could help women find themselves, maybe you could help me find myself too." It was the most honest thing Eliza had ever heard Caroline say. "All right," she said. "We'll make your dress. But Caroline, this doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't make us friends or mean all is forgiven. It just means we're willing to give you the same thing we give everyone else who walks through that door. A chance to be seen as you actually are, rather than what people expect you to be. That's all I'm asking for," Caroline said quietly. Making Caroline's wedding dress was strange and complicated and somehow healing. Caroline came for her fittings and slowly, gradually, began to unbend. She apologized, really apologized, not the insincere social nicety from the dance, but actual recognition of the harm she'd caused. She talked about growing up with impossible standards, about a mother who loved her but only knew how to show love through control, about learning cruelty as a defense mechanism and then forgetting how to put it down. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said during one fitting. "I don't forgive myself, honestly, but Thomas says that the person I was doesn't have to be the person I am now, that I can choose differently." "He's right," Eliza said, adjusting the sleeve of the dress they were creating. "We all get to choose who we become. The past doesn't disappear, but it doesn't have to define everything either." When Caroline married Thomas, she wore a dignity dress, and Eliza and Silas attended the ceremony as guests. It was small and simple, very different from the social spectacle Mrs. Thornton had undoubtedly envisioned for her daughter's wedding. But Caroline looked happier than Eliza had ever seen her, and Thomas looked at his bride with the same fierce protectiveness he'd once turned toward defending dignity. Mrs. Thornton never reconciled with their success. She remained bitter and hostile until the end, convinced that society was degrading because women were being allowed to take up space and make choices. But her power diminished year by year as more people embraced the model dignity represented, as daughters grew up with different standards, as the old rigid order slowly gave way to something more flexible and humane. 5 years after that terrible night at the dance, Eliza stood on the porch of the home she and Silas had built adjacent to the workshop, watching their daughter play in the yard. Grace was 3 years old, fearless and loud and completely convinced of her own importance in the world. She would never know what it felt like to apologize for existing, would never understand the particular shame of being told her body was wrong. Mira emerged from the workshop to join her, moving slower these days, but still sharp and fierce and entirely herself. "We're getting requests from as far as California now," Mira said, settling into the chair beside Eliza's. "Women wanting to know how to start their own dignity shops. I've been thinking we should write a manual. Something that explains not just the business model, but the philosophy behind it." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Eliza said. "You should write it. You're better with words than I am." "We'll write it together. Your story, my techniques, our shared vision. That's what people need to hear." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Grace discover a butterfly and squeal with delight. In the workshop behind them, 23 people were creating beauty and dignity and possibility, one stitch at a time. In towns across 3 territories, other workshops were opening, other women were learning that their bodies weren't problems to be solved, but lives to be celebrated. And in Red Hollow, the settlement that had once tried to break them, dignity stood as permanent proof that cruelty didn't have to win, that standards could change, that one woman's humiliation could become 1,000 women's liberation. Silas came out to join them, flour on his hands from the bread he'd been baking. He'd taken to cooking in his spare time, claiming that making food was almost as satisfying as making furniture. He kissed the top of Eliza's head and settled on the porch step, watching their daughter with the same quiet contentment that had become his default expression. "Margaret stopped by earlier," he said. "Her daughter's getting married next month and wants a dignity dress. Said it wouldn't feel like a real wedding without one." "That's 3 generations now," Mira observed. "Margaret, her daughter, and eventually her daughter's daughters. We're building something that lasts." Liza thought about the green dress that had burned, about Caroline's cruelty, about standing in the darkness convinced her life was over. She thought about Silas's impossible promise and Mira's fierce skill and the choice to walk back into that hall wearing armor made of leather and dignity. That moment had changed everything, had revealed that humiliation could be transformed into power, that loneliness could become love, that one terrible night could be the beginning of an extraordinary life. Grace ran up to the porch holding her butterfly, which she'd somehow convinced to sit on her finger, and demanded that everyone admire it immediately. Eliza scooped her up and breathed in the scent of her hair and felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. This was the life she'd built from the ashes of the one that had burned. These were the people who'd chosen her and whom she'd chosen in return. This was the legacy that would outlast all of them, not just the business or the clothes or the changed standards, but the fundamental truth they'd proved over and over again. That every woman deserved to be seen, to be celebrated, to take up space without apology, to wear beauty that honored her exactly as she was. That dignity wasn't something to be earned through conformity, but something inherent, unshakable, fierce as mountains and gentle as deerskin against bare skin. And that sometimes the worst moments of your life were actually the beginning of your best ones, if you were brave enough to stand back up and refuse to disappear. Eliza looked at her family, her friends, her life's work, and smiled. She had stood back up, and she had never stopped standing. 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 Never stopped